After a few minutes of persuasion, Hector finally managed to get permission to go deep into the dungeon for a while. Going down the dark staircase, he found himself in a room where the exhausted heroine lay behind bars. Awakened by the sound of footsteps, Leona opened her eyes, under which there were blackened bags. Hector carefully approached the cage, looking at his mistress in horror. Crouching down near the bars, the hero began to take out the medicine that he had brought especially for her. However, the almost completely blind girl, having received a cup of medicine, immediately dropped it. In shock, Hector could not hold back his tears, and Leona began to calm him down. Shaking in a wild shiver, the hero found the strength to admit that Milady was dead. As it turned out, the queen sentenced her to death for spreading false rumors about the emperor. In addition, there were those who claimed that Prince Daniel was preparing an assassination attempt on the ruler, so he was banned from the Blackwood cottage. Leona was shocked by what she heard, realizing that the prince was not capable of such a thing at all. However, these rumors were confirmed by several nobles, so the queen decided to put an end to Daniel's madness. Suddenly, a guard appeared and demanded that the hero leave the dungeon immediately. With a shudder and tears, Leona listened as the jailer forcibly let out the hero who shouted her name. In complete powerlessness and despair, the main character collapsed on her face to the floor, screaming and crying. Seeing her being tortured on the floor, the surprised guard called out to his colleague. They thought that this woman had gone completely crazy. Perhaps she had contracted madness from her husband. At that moment, starting to laugh hysterically, Leona remembered that all they did was trample on her, insult, and curse her. Therefore, no matter what happened next and whatever the future was, she decided that she would never forgive these scoundrels. At the same moment, causing the guards to shock and horror, she bit off her tongue. Bleeding and gradually losing consciousness, Leona dreamed only of getting her chance. Suddenly, she opened her eyes abruptly, as if she had woken up after a long sleep. The heroine suddenly found herself in her father's house, where she lived before she became queen. His tongue was intact, his lips were not withered, his face and hands were clean, and his eyes clearly saw the situation around. Running to the mirror, Leona saw the young girl she had once been. At the same moment, wanting to bring water to the mistress, Nancy's maid was surprised by the heroine's frightened look. Looking at her, Leona could not believe her eyes, and Nancy decided that it would be better for the mistress to wash her face and get some more sleep. The main character remembered that when she left the Tien Kingdom, she could not take the maid with her. She decided to find out how old is Nancy at the moment. Hearing that she was only 16, the heroine was shocked and did not understand how this could even be. Looking in the mirror again, she again saw the girl who she thought was weak and ugly. After everything that had happened, Leona unexpectedly returned to the time when she was still a princess and not a queen. The kingdom of Tien was once the most prosperous country in the world. The subsoil, rich in rubies and silver ore, gave a stable profit. But one day, resources became scarce, and the nobility, accustomed to the previous standard of living, refused to limit themselves. This led to the devastation of the treasury, and then the king, Leona's father, decided to start a war of conquest. In the end, after several major failures, he admitted defeat and was forced to agree to pay reparations. The heir to the king and the elder brother of the heroine, Carlos, having taken the throne of his father, decided to take revenge and unleash a war in the south, but he was also defeated. Because of this, the Southerners now demanded reparations, threatening otherwise to make the Tien their vassals. This infuriated Carlos and did not understand how the king of the southern lands dared to threaten them. The advisors tried to reassure His Majesty, believing that in this situation it was necessary just to think. As it turned out, a letter came from the Kingdom of Rotir, which spelled out the option of not paying reparations to the south. The price of this was the marriage of the king's younger sister, Leona, to which he gladly agreed. However, it was after this decision that the life of the main character turned into hell. From these memories, Leona was distracted by Nancy, who wondered why the mistress had not started eating yet. Looking at freshly baked bread, clean water, and feeling warmth, the heroine thought that in the last years of her life she had not dreamed of this. Suddenly, Leona invited the maid to breakfast together, leaving her in a stupor. Nancy was shocked, because would she dare to sit down with the princess at a meal? Then the heroine ordered her to do this, which made the maid even more confused. This reaction was mostly due to the fact that Leona had never offered her such a reaction. But this time the heroine hurried her as she was very hungry. After thanking and starting the meal, Nancy remembered that the lady was to pay a visit to the king before lunch. In surprise, Leona almost dropped the hot bread from her hands. As it turned out, a man from His Majesty came last night and asked to give the princess an invitation. Realizing with horror what was being said, Leona pretended not to remember it. However, today was the very day when everything would be decided. Helping her mistress to prepare for the reception, the maid hoped that she would have enough endurance and strength. At this moment, the heroine remembered the malevolent grin on the face of Queen Rotera, Miranda, when she saw a fragile girl in front of her. At that time, Leona's appearance could be called sickly, and the queen did not understand how the girl would fulfill her marital duty. At the same time, Miranda was happy because an unkempt, shaky, and clumsy princess was what she needed. She became the queen's tool to finally clip the wings of Prince Daniel, who had no other control. And now Leona is determined to take back everything that is due and make Miranda experience all her pain. Nancy was very surprised as she looked at the mistress, who looked like a woman for the first time today, not a girl. Suddenly the door swung open and the butler unceremoniously entered the princess, accompanied by maids. He looked at Leona furiously, not understanding how much longer she intended to keep His Highness waiting. Then Nancy decided to stand up for the mistress, who was just finishing her preparations. Furious that this impudent girl dared to look up at him, the butler waved his hand at her. But suddenly there was an order to stop immediately, which made him stupefied. The main character wanted the butler to talk to her and leave the maid alone. She resented the butler's exaltation over Nancy, knowing that it was the princess's maid and not his. The butler was taken aback, not understanding how this girl dared to look into his eyes. He decided that the princess should teach her servants discipline because otherwise His Majesty would scold her. Leona then decided that the king was directly responsible for the butler's rudeness towards her. Clenching his fists in fury, the butler looked menacingly at the heroine, who remained unmoved. She noticed that he didn't say anything in response, which shocked him and the other servants. Humbly bowing, he apologized to the princess, but as it turned out, she did not need it. Instead, the butler must apologize to Nancy, who was just trying to protect the mistress. After that, he grudgingly apologized to the maid, and she did the same. The girls then proudly walked away, leaving the butler completely confused by what was happening. When she came to the king for an audience, she greeted him, calling him her brother. Carlos was furious and shocked that she dared to call him that. He wondered if Leona had done something, but in fact, she just wanted to talk. The heroine was well aware that a messenger from Roter had come to His Majesty. Carlos was not interested, and he thought that his sister probably knew about the state of affairs in their kingdom. He believed that before that, for all her uselessness, Leona had lived happily off taxes, and now it was time to pay. Fortunately, Queen Rotera agreed to pay reparations to the south instead of Tien. In return, she asked only that Carlos marry Leona to Prince Daniel. Frowning, the heroine wondered if her brother just wanted to show his disrespect. Then she decided to remind her that His Majesty had no right to talk to her like that. After all, she can refuse, and then will she be tied up and taken in a cage like a slave? Or if Leona committed suicide, how would Carlos deal with the reparations problem? However, if he lies at the feet of the princess and asks for help, then the royal family of Rotera will like it very much. Furious at these words, Carlos jumped up from his seat and waved his hand in the direction of the heroine. At that moment, Prince Daniel arrived at Miranda's house for an audience, on her orders. She was happy to report that she had prepared a bride for him, who was as mediocre as the prince himself. Believing that her future husband should bring the bride home, Miranda sent Daniel to Tien. Meanwhile, after leaving Carlos's office, there was a slight swelling on Leona's cheek, which greatly frightened Nancy. However, the heroine considered the slap to be a trifle compared to the painful imprisonment. It was worth seeing Carlos's excitement and shock, who could not squeeze anything out of himself except insults. Also, the heroine wanted her maid to go with her to Rotier. She knew that Nancy was born in Tiene and had her family here, but Leon still needed her. After all, in the past, almost all of Rotier's people looked at the heroine as an enemy and plotted various intrigues. And those people who became her support and family, she met much later. Seeing the tears in her eyes, Nancy immediately agreed to go with her. Leona promised that it would not be forever and that when the right moment came, the maid would be able to return to Tien, to her family. But as it turned out, Nancy did not want to return here at all, which was very pleasant for the heroine. The maid firmly decided that she was ready to follow her mistress, even to the ends of the earth. Meanwhile, the servants loaded Leona's belongings and discussed her and the upcoming trip with irritation. Coming out to them, the heroine again saw those fake smiles on the faces of the servants and their disgusted looks. However, now, the girl was no longer alone and was very happy that she was finally leaving. She had to go to the depths of the underworld, where two close people were waiting for her. At the same time, fragments of the past life began to pop up in memory, causing heartache. Leona remembered well the moment when she and Daniel first met. At that time, she was in despair that she was leaving here completely alone and prayed constantly. Perhaps that's why at the first meeting with the prince, the heroine did not even think about why he personally decided to come for her. The girl was blind with fear and terror, which simply clouded her mind. The most important lesson from Leona's past life was that she should not give in to fear. Meanwhile, Nancy decided to give the princess a warm blanket, in case it got very cold. Thanking her, Leona suddenly noticed a carriage from Rotier approaching. When the carriage stopped, the Duke's secretary, Gregory, got out of it. The Duke was a relative of Daniel's mother, the former Empress, as well as Miranda's only rival. In a previous life, he was accused of driving the prince insane and executed. Now, the heroine could not allow Gregory's death, but first of all, she had to stop Daniel's madness. Taking the princess to the carriage, the secretary promised to help if something suddenly happened. Leona remembered that they would be attacked by bandits on the way, but the prince would not even think about saving her. Because Daniel himself did not have any will to live, and the girl only now understood this. However, at that moment, the heroine stopped trusting anyone and also began to fear the prince. She shivered at his mere presence, and there could be no question of any intimacy. When she was thrown into prison, Daniel did not say a single comforting word, but at the same time he came to feed Leona. And even though he was closed from the whole world and from her, the heroine still did not want to part with him. There were things that only Leona knew about him, and she was determined to make Daniel king. First of all, she introduced herself and admitted that it was an honor for her to meet the hero. He had deep-set eyes with a sharp gaze, flame-colored hair, and graceful eyebrows. The heroine wondered if he really had always been like this. As it turned out, the prince had heard about the girl that she was taciturn, but apparently it turned out to be speculation. Leona was sure that in addition to this, he had also heard insults addressed to her from the queen's lips. She understood that Miranda was showing her disrespect not only to her, but also to him. However, Daniel did not want to share everything he heard with the heroine, as he did not know how to console crying women. But Leona insisted, and then the hero admitted that he had heard about her, as if the heroine was a coward and a stutterer. In response, the girl promised that although she was not perfect, she would certainly not be an ungrateful wife. She was sure that the best revenge would be to put the proud King Daniel on the throne. The prince was surprised by her words, as if Leona already knew everything about them. The heroine pretended that she had just heard various rumors. But Daniel did not like the fact that the girl pretended to know him perfectly. He had the impression that Leona was showing genuine pity for him. The heroine looked at him in horror, not understanding if she had offended His Highness in any way. After all, she would never dare to show compassion to him, but in the prince's opinion, it was only worse. He knew very well that they were now heading directly to the lair of snakes. Leona understood that one way or another, he was right, and for the sake of the plan, it was not worth complicating their relationship. She pretended that she did not know how he had survived there all this time and was ready to enter this house with him. The girl considered herself strong, and no matter what trials fell to their lot, she wanted to overcome everything together. And perhaps Leona was nothing now, but she was determined to always be on the side of the hero. By extending her hand to him, the heroine thereby showed that she wanted to become close friends with Daniel. The prince found it strange, because they were in a different relationship, but the girl believed that even a husband and wife could be friends. She agreed to the lack of a relationship and marriage on paper, but at first she just wanted to be friends so that trust would appear. Seeing how the hero froze thoughtfully in place, Leona thought that she must have been in a hurry. But suddenly Daniel grabbed her hand, confusing the heroine. After half a day of driving, Leona fully felt her weakness and soreness. Carlos did not miss the opportunity to scold her, believing that his sister looked like a milkmaid, which is why she decided to lose weight. Nothing changed in Rotera, and surrounded by beauties, the heroine stood out even more with her loneliness. Now, Leona tried to eat as much as possible to restore her health. However, now, sitting in the carriage, she felt a strong nausea from the shaking on her full stomach. But she also understood that if she asked to stop, she might not be believed because the prince still did not trust her. He was still lonely, not wanting to let anyone near him out of fear, being in a vicious circle of distrust. Leona decided to be patient and gradually gain his trust, learning a little about the prince. Suddenly, the carriage abruptly began to stop, which caused the heroine to hit her head hard. Daniel decided to go outside for a while, which made her even more surprised. After he left, Nancy came, brought her a glass of water, and invited her to go out and get some fresh air. Once outside, Leona immediately felt a refreshing breeze that greatly relieved her condition. She decided to ask the maid to ask the secretary what was the reason for such a sudden stop. As soon as Nancy walked away, the heroine looked at the prince, who was standing with his back to her. In her previous life, she had only seen him from this angle, unsuccessfully trying to start a dialogue with Daniel. But all her attempts ended in failure as she was afraid of him, and the prince was drowning in his own torments. At this time, Nancy returned, and it turned out that the secretary did not know anything, and she had to ask the prince directly. The maid decided that it would be better for the mistress to do this, because soon they would become spouses anyway. The heroine went to him, realizing that she really had nothing to lose. To her surprise, Daniel wondered if she really didn't know the reason for their stopping. It was about the girl's shameless pretense, which only puzzled her even more. In fact, the prince saw Leona's condition in the carriage and realized that if he did not stop, she would definitely vomit. And he immediately wanted to clarify that if she was trying to attract his attention with such antics, then it was better to discard it immediately. Realizing that the hatred in his gaze was not directed at her at all, the heroine sincerely smiled in response. Not expecting such a reaction, the prince was confused for a few seconds. Leona thanked His Highness from the bottom of her heart in curtsy for the care shown to her. Coming out of his stupor and taking a deep breath, Daniel remembered that when they arrived, the heroine would meet with the queen, and the hero very much wanted the princess not to curtsy at this meeting. Kneeling before her, the prince hoped that the heroine would do the same in front of Miranda. He also believed that the hands should be hidden in the folds of the dress, and in no case should you get up until the queen said. Agreeing convulsively, Leona wanted nothing more than for His Highness to get up from his knees, but Daniel also decided to clarify that one should not expect any praise from Miranda, even for good deeds. Seeing her fragility, the prince was not sure that the girl would be able to cope with the role of queen. However, if she was really as smart as she seemed at first glance, she would definitely be able to attract Miranda's attention. The prince decided that even if Leona became a burden to him, he was ready to sacrifice himself as a last resort. After all, in his opinion, it was better to live like this than to continue to live under the oppression of his stepmother. Looking out the window, the heroine remembered that the place of the bandits' attack was not far from the ominous forest, which was also called the Black Forest. She decided that at all costs she had to protect the prince, who, in a previous life, was wounded in the chest. However, vague meanings that perhaps nothing would work out did not leave Leona's head. In addition, the girl was frightened by the incredibly penetrating gaze of Daniel, who seemed to know everything about her. Suddenly, the horses squealed and the carriage shook violently, and the heroine realized that the attack had begun. At the same second, Leona rushed at the hero, covering him with her body. Outside, the knights shouted that the first thing to do was to protect the prince and princess. Suddenly, Daniel pushed the heroine away and headed for the door of the carriage, leaving her in a stupor. From a secret section in the ceiling, he took out a large sword and prepared to repel the attack. Opening the door with a kick, the hero made a sharp swing and hit the first enemy in the stomach with lightning speed. Leona watched in shock as the hero deftly dispatched the attackers without leaving the carriage. Suddenly, she saw the enemy sneaking up on him from the right and shouted about it, thanks to which Daniel had time to react. Soon after, the bandits ran away from them in terror, and the heroes breathed a sigh of relief. The Duke's secretary wondered if the prince was okay, but he asked to take care of the princess. Then the secretary immediately found out that everything was fine with her and she was not hurt. There were also no seriously injured or dead, and the prince received a small scratch on his cheek. Leona hurried to find out about Nancy's condition and was glad that everything turned out fine. Meanwhile, the prince looked at her suspiciously, his hands clasped in a lock. He couldn't understand how she understood the attack and told him to duck. The girl decided to answer evasively that she was just afraid of the carriage overturning. She tried to wipe the blood on Daniel's cheek, and he, in turn, still wanted to hear the answer to his question. It was clear from her that she was not lying, and if Leona really knew about the attack, then, in the hero's opinion, she could be at the same time with them. However, the heroine only wanted him to let go of her hand and let her wipe the blood from her face. The wound was small, but the scar would probably remain, so she advised me to treat the scratch with an ointment upon arrival. Later, continuing in the carriage, the girl realized that this time she managed to protect him. And the heroine was incredibly happy about this because in her past life, everything turned out much worse. Upon arrival in the kingdom of Rothair, she and Daniel had to separate, and Leona hoped that he would receive decent treatment. Later, while Nancy was preparing her to meet the queen, Miranda's servant, Arya, informed her that the king would not be able to receive her. The heroine knew that the monarch had been unconscious for several years, so the queen took all power into her own hands. Miranda's maid hoped that the princess would dress appropriately to meet her mistress. After all, according to Arya, Her Majesty wants to see a chaste and elegant princess. Leona thought that the queen seemed to love her maid and wanted to know from her what to watch out for. Arya knew from the words of the mistress that the heroine was still a girl, so such an answer discouraged her. Leona heard that she just needed to behave decently because Miranda had deep, motherly feelings. Nancy offered her to wear a lot of jewelry, but Leona decided to limit herself to a simple but beautiful dress. As she escorted the princess to the queen, Arya thought that the Tien kingdom probably did not attach much importance to status. The princess is the second most important figure, after the queen, so such a close relationship with the maid could be damaging. But the heroine in response decided that Nancy was her maid in Tien all this time, so there is nothing unusual in this. Then Arya reproached her because the queen does not like when servants are treated warmly. These words seemed strange to the heroine because the maid herself called Miranda generous, and besides, she herself would decide what to do. Arya was shocked because Leona turned out to be not at all what people said about her. Besides, the queen could not be unaware of it. In turn, the heroine was glad that she rebuffed Arya, and now it remains only to wait for it to reach the ears of the queen. Her plan was to turn Miranda's attention to herself so that she would fall behind Daniel. Approaching Her Highness's chambers next to which the guards stood, Arya hurried to introduce her guest to the queen. Looking at the heroine, the maid was delighted, thinking that she was about to cry. But in fact, Leona could hardly hold back a smile, covering her mouth with her hand. In her previous life, when the doors opened, she burst into tears, and judging by the reaction, everyone was just waiting for this. Now she decided not to shed a tear, which greatly puzzled Arya. From the entrance to the queen herself, there were 4 doors to pass. These were the most spacious chambers in the palace. As it was in the memory of the main character, Miranda met her with an arrogant face and a poisonous smile. The princess entered and bowed in a curtsy of the Rotira style, greeting Her Highness. Pretty surprised by this, the queen ordered Arya to bring something cool. Miranda was perplexed because it was only the beginning of summer and it was already so hot outside. She asked Leona about the attack and learned that the accompanying knights did an excellent job. Then the queen decided to find out if the prince really injured his face while protecting his future wife. Making a sad look, the heroine pretended that the prince was just sitting still. Miranda smiled in response because the hero had not been distinguished by abilities in fencing since childhood. With a sudden change in her face, Leone wondered if the crown prince of the kingdom didn't wield a sword. Hearing her call Daniel Crown Prince, Miranda's face darkened and she fell into a stupor. However, the heroine knew that it was Daniel who was the eldest son of the king, and therefore the heir. Horrified and furious, the queen thought that for lies and unflattering statements about the kingdom, the girl could lose her head. Leona knew well that the crown prince was not only the king's firstborn, but also the heir to the throne. Miranda wanted to make her son Tyler the heir, so she put a lot of pressure on the nobility and tried to strip Daniel of the title. Therefore, when she called the hero the crown prince, these words naturally caused such a reaction. Pretending to be tired, the queen sent the girl to rest, deciding to take care of her education in the future. As she left, Leona was glad that her bait had worked and that Miranda would be less of bullying Daniel. Now the first thing to do was to make a plan, and there was very little time. Suddenly, she was painfully pushed in the side by someone who wondered who was wandering around Mother's palace so carelessly. Looking up, the heroine saw Prince Tyler, Miranda's son, to her horror. The young prince did not understand why the heroine trembled so much, as if he had done something bad. However, the mere sight of him made Leona sick, because how could he forget what he had done? This man, in the past, finally ruined the life of the main character. He secretly snuck into the bedroom of his older brother's wife and abused her. And although the servants noticed him, Miranda put all the blame on her. The queen decided that the girl went mad and seduced her husband's half-brother. And now, gathering all her will into a fist, the heroine pretended that she did not recognize His Highness. Tyler didn't understand why there were such pleasantries, since they were now one family. He thought that Leona would only cry, but the heroine turned out to be calm and very beautiful. Putting his arm around her waist, he began to flirt with her, but Leona demanded to let her go. However, Tyler suddenly decided that his brother didn't seem to be interested in women at all, and he was sorry that she married this premature, after which the heroine forcefully pushed the scoundrel away. Hurting himself and becoming furious, the prince did not understand what she was allowing herself. Tyler wanted to hit back, but he was stopped by Daniel's sudden voice. The villain was shocked by the unexpected appearance of his older brother, frozen in place from confusion. Daniel decided to take his wife with him and beckoned her with his hand, confusing Tyler. For a while, he and Leona walked silently along the courtyard corridors. At some point, the hero suddenly wondered if the girl knew who she had met. Having received a detailed answer from her, he wanted her not to cross paths with him again, if possible. In his opinion, Tyler was still young and could cause problems, but if she herself wanted to communicate with him, the hero would not stop. The heroine wondered if the prince really thinks that she is one of those who can trust Tyler. Even though she was sold and became Daniel's wife, Leona did not consider herself so immoral. But that wasn't what the prince meant at all. It was just that anyone else would have chosen her younger brother instead of him. Hearing in response that the heroine was not one of them and she chose him, Daniel was shocked. He didn't understand how she could be so sure of this. After all, in this place, the hero was as vulnerable as possible and subject to attacks. Leona was outraged that he considered her the one who, unable to stand all this, would give his heart to someone who abused his brother's wife. After all, in this case, will Daniel be able to call her his wife and a close person? The prince apologized for not thinking about this, and the heroine promised to remember his words about Tyler. As she left, Leona hoped that His Highness would think of her soul, which was under this shell. She knew she might have been being too emotional, but when it came to Tyler, it was hard for her to stay calm. Meanwhile, Daniel could not figure out his feelings for the heroine, experiencing a strange feeling of kinship. A little later, at one of the meetings, the queen got tired of having to repeat the same thing several times. Everyone present was shocked by her decision to cancel the wedding, so that the health of the barely alive king would not deteriorate. People considered this reason unthinkable, because it was about the marriage of a prince and princess, but they could not go against the word of the queen. Duke Gregory was furious when he learned of this news and hoped that Daniel would not let it go. After all, how can you just postpone the wedding of the king's legitimate son? Moreover, this event was associated not only with the reputation of the prince himself, but also with the honor of his future wife. However, Daniel himself understood that the order was already there, and the queen would never change her mind. Then Gregory wondered if the hero had talked about this with the princess. If the king regained consciousness even for a short time, he wanted to tell him everything himself. The prince considered this idea useless, since the king had been ill for a very long time. He and the first empress loved and respected each other very much, but after her death, the king fell into deep despair. It caused an unknown mental illness, which chained him to bed. Gregory hoped that he would come to his senses, because this had already happened a few months ago, and he was even engaged in state affairs. However, Daniel was not so optimistic because it only lasted a few days. But the Duke considered even this a good option to overthrow Miranda. Looking at the handsome prince with a kind heart, who was gradually fading, losing his strength and authority, Gregory was ready to kill the queen himself. He also wanted Daniel to take care of the princess, but the hero thought she was stronger than he thought. But the Duke knew that she had no one to rely on in a foreign land, and he was sorry to see her have to endure the abuse. Then the prince decided to ask if the consolations of such a useless husband as he could help her. Putting his hand on his shoulder, Gregory knew that she only had Daniel, so he should have taken the girl for a walk. When Daniel was left alone, he thought that surely the heroine blames him for everything. At this time, while embroidering a handkerchief, Leona accidentally pricked her finger, which greatly frightened Nancy. The maid was horrified that this had happened to her mistress's beautiful hands. She wanted to continue the embroidery instead of her, but the heroine decided to finish it herself. Nancy was very worried about the fact that so many difficulties fell to the lot of the mistress after coming here. The heroine understood that it seemed that she had angered the queen so much that she canceled the wedding, which, however, the girl was happy about. Just in case, she decided to warn Nancy that in this place, even the walls have ears, so she needs to be careful in her words and deeds. After that, she asked the maid to bring her an ointment, which she specially took with her. Leona also decided to apologize to Nancy, who apparently also caused a lot of trouble. Then the maid pretended that it was not hard for her at all, and she was ready to bring at least 100 tubes of ointment. While she was following it, the heroine decided to analyze the information that she had collected over the past week. Interesting was the news about the founding of the Imperial Academy on the Eastern continent. The empire possessed great power and the highest level of culture. The girl thought that this was a great opportunity for the prince, deciding to send him there. She remembered that around the age of 21, his depression worsened and he began to go insane. Therefore, it was necessary to send him away from the queen's eyes as soon as possible. However, this required permission, and while the king was unconscious, all power was in the hands of Daniel's stepmother. At that moment, Nancy returned, happily carrying in her hands the ointment that the mistress had requested. While she was treating the cut on Leona's finger, the heroine thought that Gregory also did not have the authority to send the prince abroad. In addition, in order to appear in high society, Leone had to embroider scarves herself and give them to other ladies so as not to kneel. Also, according to Nancy, she handed the letter to Madame Marquise Roubert, who promised to answer soon, but so far remained silent. As it turned out, the heroine in the letter asked him for permission to meet with his daughter. She pretended to have heard something about this girl in the palace, so she was looking for a meeting. This time, the heroine decided at all costs not to lose Daniel and Gwen. Meanwhile, reading the princess's letter, Rupert was shocked that the girl who had angered the queen wanted to meet his daughter. The problem was that the queen would probably find out about this meeting, who was doing everything to put Tyler on the throne. Therefore, in order to avoid trouble, the Marquis decided to refuse Leone's request. Suddenly, Gwen burst into his office, taking her father by surprise. Putting her arm tightly around his shoulders, she decided to find out what he was doing there, all alone. Suddenly, her eyes fell on the letter, which at that moment was lying in front of the Marquis, which horrified him. The girl immediately grabbed him, confusing her father. Gwen was surprised to find that the letter said that she was sick and would not be able to come to see the princess. She wondered how she had managed to get sick without noticing. She also wanted to know what Leona had written that Rupert had decided to answer her thus. Moreover, who would believe in this nonsense about the disease, knowing about the girl's steely health? Her father was horrified, believing that he was doing all this for her, realizing that if they met, the queen would hate her. But Gwen believed that Miranda was just trying to make her son king, so she made a despotism. However, the heroine was not a cowardly person, and her father wondered what she was up to. Despite his persuasion, Gwen decided to meet with the princess, believing that nothing would harm her reputation. After the conversation, going down the stairs, the heroine met her nanny, which made her incredibly happy. Looking at the mistress's shaggy hair, the old woman was in despair, tired of trying to put it in order. However, to her surprise, the heroine asked to do what the nanny loved the most. The girl wanted to look like the young ladies in the Place Michel, and a maid had to help her with this. Meanwhile, Leona sat in the gazebo of the palace garden, in the company of Nancy, and continued to embroider handkerchiefs. Suddenly, a loud sound of breaking glass was heard from the palace, which terrified the girls. The maid decided to go and see what caused such sounds. Most of all, Leona was interested in whether it was an accident or if Daniel himself had crashed something. The sound of such a volume could only be caused by the breaking of several panes of glass in the windows. In a previous life, the prince had seizures when he smashed objects or became very afraid of something. His fears were confirmed, and Nancy returned and reported that it was His Highness. The reasons were unknown, but the hero threw some object and broke the window. To the maid's surprise, the princess immediately ran towards the palace, leaving her confused. Near the room where the prince was, Duke Gregory was standing, nervously rubbing his hands. The heroine decided first of all to find out from him what exactly happened to the prince. As it turned out, it was a meeting of high-ranking aristocrats, which is held every few days. Today, the queen allowed Daniel to attend, criticizing him for not yet enlisting the support of the court. She herself had not allowed him to attend previous such gatherings, and now she had decided to simply humiliate the prince in front of others. Most of all, Daniel was afraid that this could have a bad effect on the main character. Deciding to try to go to him, she immediately heard the order to go out immediately. The heroine hoped that the prince would stop being angry, because anger interferes with achieving goals and can have a bad effect on health. Then the hero repeated his order to leave immediately, deciding that he would not repeat it a third time. The girl wondered if she still decides to stay until the end. Will Daniel really throw her out the window too? But the prince was sure that he had nothing left, and if he threw his wife out of the window, then no one would even be surprised. The heroine in response decided that if it would help him stop being angry, then she agreed. At this moment, the prince wondered if there was anything in this world that his wife was afraid of. After all, she, even in front of the queen herself, behaves very boldly and boldly. As it turned out, the only thing that the heroine was afraid of was that her husband would harm himself. She understood that in the future they would have many unpleasant moments, but they could not allow this to prevail. Leona was fully convinced that the prince had sufficient abilities and rights. However, the hero, on the contrary, considered himself a non-entity from which nothing would come of it. Then the girl remembered that her mother died early, and her father had never been particularly interested in her, and her only brother took pleasure in insulting his sister every day. Therefore, she also considered herself useless and stupid, but now it was different. After all, people who harm others do so unable to endure their inner emptiness. Suddenly, the prince ran his hand through the heroine's hair, which made her think that he felt better. The hero was sincerely grateful to her for helping him get out of despair. After a while, one of the royal maids ordered Nancy to take the bucket to the laundry. When asked about the contents of the bucket, the maid decided not to answer, considering Nancy a redneck who would not understand anything anyway. Restraining her emotions, the girl wondered how her mistress was doing. At this time, Arya was standing next to Leona and wondered if she had learned the genealogy. Hearing that the heroine had already learned everything, the maid bulged her eyes in surprise. It could take months to memorize the bloodline, and Leona had only received it yesterday, so Arya didn't believe her. Looking at her sternly, the princess couldn't understand how a maid could judge whether she was telling the truth or not. Dismayed, Arya decided to ask if she could check it. Of course, Leona could tell, but why should she prove the truthfulness of her words to the maid? The order was given by the queen, and did she order the heroine to report to her? Leona knew that Arya was here to take care of her, so she tried to treat her with respect as well. However, if the maid continues like this, the princess will be forced to take action. At that moment, Nancy reported the arrival of the guest to the mistress, and Leona gave her permission. With a flying gait, Gwen came to her, joyfully greeting her highness. Delighted at her arrival, the princess ordered Nancy to take her guest to the living room. Arya was confused, wondering if Leona could be familiar with the Marquise's family. A few minutes later, the heroine went to the living room to meet the one who in her past life was her support. And only now did Leona realize that in all this time she had never thanked her. Sitting down at the table, Gwen once again introduced herself to the princess, asking her to call her by her first name. The girl was grateful to her highness for the invitation, and the heroine herself understood that the Marquis probably did not want to let her go. Pretending that her father had happily let her go, Gwen decided to change the subject by asking a question. She understood that it might be inappropriate, but she still wondered where the princess's personal maid was. The girl was very surprised to learn that the maid had not yet been appointed. Leona felt that this had not yet been decided, and in the meantime, this position was temporarily held by Arya. But in Gwen's opinion, a maid of about the same age as her would be more suitable. Therefore, the girl firmly decided to visit the princess as often as possible. Just a few days ago, she was given a very docile horse, and she invited the princess to ride. In her previous life, the heroine was afraid of large horses, so she could not even come close, but she did not want to refuse Gwen. Therefore, Leona agreed, on the condition that the girl would teach her everything. Suddenly, the princess leaned over to Gwen, deciding to remove the obstructing hair from her face. Laughing, the girl thought she was a very interesting person. After learning that everyone thought she was quiet, Leona suggested that perhaps she was also considered stupid and unpretentious. However, Gwen was sure that gossip was liked by those who did not understand people at all. After that, the girl unexpectedly got ready, agreeing to go to the horse field nearby in 3 days. Leona was surprised that she had decided to leave so soon, which made her face look sad. Seeing this, Gwen decided to be immodest and asked for another cup of tea. Meanwhile, Arya came to the queen, who was sitting on the sofa in a house dress, holding a newly received letter in her hands. The sender of the message was Gregory, who wanted to get the authority to prepare for the anniversary of the former queen. Miranda was originally a contender for the role of queen, but the king fell in love with another and married her. Subsequently, she still got the desired place, but the king did not cease to be sad for his late wife. This was far from the only reason why the heart of the monarch could not be conquered by Miranda. However, she still continued to blame Daniel's mother for everything, which caused her relationship with the king to get worse. So now she wanted to kill Duke Gregory, the late queen's brother and Daniel's uncle, as well as the prince himself. Arya was sure that if only the mistress wanted, Gregory would immediately kneel in front of her, so she had nothing to worry about. Also, the queen was eager to know how the study of the princess's bloodline was going. Hearing that she had already learned it, Miranda thought that this bastard had dared to lie to her. Now she wondered if Leona would be able to lie, looking directly into the queen's eyes. A little later, the heroine gave the royal maid her old clothes to make new sleeves. The girl took them as if they were garbage and, looking disgustedly at Leona, went to carry out the order. Nancy didn't understand why her mistress was doing nothing when she saw such open disrespect. First of all, it was important to understand that she did not tolerate it out of fear. She also knew that the other maids were bullying Nancy, but if they were just ordered now, nothing would change. The maid was willing to be patient a little longer, but she was worried that she did not understand the mistress's thoughts at all. At this time, Arya appeared, who received orders to bring the princess to Her Highness. As it turned out, she reported to Miranda that Leona had learned the bloodline, and then the queen gave such an order. At this moment, the heroine could hardly hold back a laugh, which puzzled the maid a little. Leona was shocked at how obvious the queen's intentions were. But before that, the heroine pretended to want to give Nancy an errand. Leona wanted the maid to go to the cook and ask him to cook a partridge for dinner. Arya thought it was ridiculous because she was about to be scolded by the queen, and she was worried about dinner. Seeing how distracted she was, Leona immediately ordered Nancy to report to the prince that Miranda had summoned her. Being in a state of shock, the maid promised to hand over everything to the cook. At the same moment, the heroine accepted the invitation and followed Arya. The queen waited in the dimly lit hall, sitting proudly on her throne. The heroine curtsied to greet Her Highness, while Miranda was happy to report that she already knew everything. And she thought it was simply disgusting that the girl dared to lie to her so brazenly that she had already learned the entire genealogy. But the heroine continued to stand her ground, and then the queen beckoned to the maid with her hand. Having received a bloodline from her, Miranda wanted to hear the name of the heir to the king before last. Leona answered the question calmly and without hesitation, sending Miranda into a stupor. It was immediately followed by a second question, to which she also easily answered. With each new answer, rage boiled inside the queen until she finally lost her temper. The girl wondered if she had made a mistake, but Miranda thought that she knew it herself. The queen was still perplexed by how dare Leona deceive her so brazenly. The girl was shocked, remembering that she was only obediently following the order. In her previous life, she had been studying the bloodline for a whole year, under the ridicule and insults of Her Highness. With a wave of her hand, Miranda thought that Arya was not only a servant, but also a kind of teacher for the princess. And as a teacher, she had the right to educate the deceiver, so the queen ordered the rod to be brought. At the same moment, two young maids embraced the heroine from both sides. At this moment, Leona realized that she could not even memorize the bloodline because nothing would change anyway. The queen believed that the fact that she was able to tell the genealogy without hesitation was already proof of her lies. Leona felt cold hands pull back the back of her dress, exposing her back. A second later, the heroine cried out loudly, feeling a sharp pain from the blow with the rod. After a few blows, Prince Daniel suddenly appeared and snatched the princess from the hands of the maids. He understood that if Leona was really guilty in front of Her Highness, then she had to be punished. But was the queen so cruel that she thought this punishment was appropriate? Miranda was surprised to see how close the relationship was between the two, but Daniel also knew about the fragile health of his wife, so he offered to punish himself instead of her. Carefully taking the princess in his arms, he carried her to the exit under Miranda's gaze. Having lost consciousness in his arms, the heroine abruptly came to her senses from Nancy's heart-rending screams. As it turned out, they were now in Prince Daniel's palace. At some point, it seemed to the maid that her mistress had died because Leona did not regain consciousness for a very long time. The heroine felt a strange sensation under her back, and it turned out that she was lying on medicine. The doctors prescribed her to rest and lie down, and since there was no way to apply the medicine, they decided to simply put it under her back. Leona remembered how in her previous life, scars also appeared on her body, and she was forced to wear clothes with a high collar. It was especially difficult in hot weather, but at that time, she had no one to complain to. This time, when her eyes began to darken, she clearly saw that Daniel had gripped her tightly. Nancy told how she immediately began to carry out her mistress's order. Then the prince decided that this was not a good sign and immediately rushed to the queen. Leona was surprised because she was almost sure that he would not come. It seemed to her that he would just pretend that he did not know anything, because he could not do anything in such a situation. Moreover, he carried her out of there in his arms, knowing that this would greatly anger the queen. The heroine found out that the prince left as soon as she received medical attention, and then Gregory came. Leona then tried to get up to see him, but Nancy immediately stopped her. The girl needed to recover, so getting up was out of the question. At this time, the Duke stood in front of the hero and wondered how Miranda dared to hit the princess. What was even more surprising was Daniel, who had previously avoided the queen, and then suddenly saved the princess from her hands. No matter how domineering Miranda was, how could she commit such an atrocity? The prince was sure that if the Duke did something now, Leona could suffer. Gregory agreed not to announce this incident at the general meeting, but he could not stand idly by either. However, even if the rumors spread, they would have no effect as most of the aristocrats supported Her Highness. But if the beating of the princess becomes known, then there will be much fewer who adhere to neutrality. After talking to his uncle, Daniel stopped by Leone's house, wanting to check on her. The girl became interested in where Nancy was, and as it turned out, she fell asleep while taking care of her. Then Leona decided to take the maid and go to her palace. But the prince offered to stay with him and recover until the end. Besides, now it was necessary to replace the medicine. Since Nancy was asleep, the prince decided to do it himself, which greatly surprised the girl. Lifting her, he began to replace medicinal herbs, and the heroine decided to apologize for ruining his bed. However, the hero saw no reason to worry, since the bed could always be replaced. After completing the procedure, Daniel carefully put the heroine back, holding her with his hands. Suddenly, he noticed that her hair was lying loose and partially fell on the place where the medicine was. Then he decided to use his tie to tie them carefully. Leona watched very carefully as he gently touched her hair. Looking at her face, the prince fell into a stupor, not understanding why she was smiling. But the heroine was just pleased that he was so diligently tying her hair. Now he wanted her to sleep, but the girl suddenly wanted him to be with her for a while. However, she also understood that perhaps the hero was very tired, so she did not want to insist. Frozen in place for a while, Daniel took the heroine's hand and sat down next to her. The wounds on the girl's back healed only after a few days, during which it was difficult to move. During this time she could only rest, under the watchful eye of Nancy. At last Gwen arrived, unsure whether to leave their horse ride in force or better to postpone. But Leona was calm, because it no longer hurt when walking. She only needed to take one medicine before going to bed. It prevented the formation of scars, so that the wound healed completely. Gwen insisted on postponing the walk until she was fully recovered, worrying about the prince's feelings as well. Leona reassured her that if she were not well, she would not have asked for it. Seeing a beautiful bouquet next to the bed, Gwen wondered who brought these flowers. It was a gift from one of the many nobles who came to visit the heroine. At the same time, Leona was well aware that this was the direct influence of Duke Gregory. And although it was impossible to fully understand his intentions, the princess knew exactly what to do. Gwen understood that she had come a long way to portray the princess, but she was still weak and vulnerable. The heroine decided to brush off that the queen punished her because she was worried about the prince. However, Gwen also noticed that contrary to the opinion of the nobles, society had formed the opinion that Leona was wise and kind-hearted. In the girl's opinion, this meant that those who fell at the queen's feet did not do so, but those who did not succumb criticized her actions. Meanwhile, the royal maid came in, which angered Gwen because the princess needed a rest. As it turned out, she only wanted to give her belongings, which were completely patched up. Having taken them for herself, Leona was extremely pleased with the work, believing that the maid even exceeded her expectations. The maid responded by pretending that she was only carrying out the mistress's task. Suddenly, the heroine began to take out a bag with gold coins from her pocket. She decided to especially reward the servants for their good work, wanting them to manage the money wisely. The maid was taken aback by the surprise and thanked the princess from the bottom of her heart. Gwen was against such excessive generosity because it could lead to bad inclinations on the part of the servants. The heroine considered this more than just generosity, because this girl did not even touch her clothes with a needle but still received gold. This maid did not want to listen to her, so she simply took these things to Nancy, who sewed them up. Enraged, Gwen immediately went to return this maid to put her in her place. But Leona stopped her, believing that there was no need for it yet, because she also asked Nancy not to refuse her. Taken aback by such an answer, the heroine looked at the princess in bewilderment. After a while, they finally went for a horseback ride along a beautiful forest. Gwen felt that Leone needed to hold the bridle tighter and stop being afraid to straighten her back. At the girl's behest, 10 escorts also went with them. The heroine happily inhaled the fresh air with her lungs, which immediately made her feel better. Gwen noticed that, judging by the weather, even God was glad that the princess was recovering. The only thing that bothered the Marquise was the presence of Arya with them. At this moment, the queen's maid was thinking about how the reputation of the nobles in her eyes was rapidly declining. Due to the presence of the Marquise, it will be more difficult for her to push the princess for fear of corporal punishment. In the meantime, they arrived at the slope of the mountain, from which there was an amazing view of the forest. Gwen wanted the princess to remember about safety because the slope was very steep. After that, everyone began to spread blankets and prepare for a picnic. The heroine experienced a wonderful feeling from inhaling fresh air, which she managed to miss. In any case, even if she couldn't see into the future, at least Leona was firm in her intentions. Suddenly, she heard Nancy's voice calling her for tea. Suddenly, the heroine asked the maid to bring Arya to her, which greatly puzzled the girl. Arya was also surprised to come to the princess who had personally called her. Above all, Leona hoped that the queen's maid was pleased with the walk. Arya frowned warily, not understanding why she was so worried. She hoped for the understanding of the princess, because of her age it was difficult for her even to walk. Leona then admitted that she must have been mistaken in thinking that the maid was unhappy, that she did not cling to the queen and begging her. In addition, it must have come as a surprise to Arya that she survived, endured the cruel treatment, and received the support of the nobles. While the maid was shocked by what she heard, the princess also understood that Arya could not be happy. Suddenly, Leona grabbed her hand, causing the maid to get completely lost. The heroine knew about the surveillance of her, and that surely the maid would be happy if she turned out to be a fool, unable to speak. The princess also remembered how Arya had seen her in this state before, in a previous life. Terrified, the maid screamed that she would tell the queen immediately. Looking at her, Leona thought that people were actually very cruel. When she first came to this negligent place, she could trust no one except the queen's maid. Shocked by this nonsense, Arya did not understand what kind of heresy this woman was carrying. Suddenly, leaning the maid's hand towards her, the heroine took a step into the cliff. Everyone present looked in shock as the princess began to rapidly disappear behind the edge of the cliff. A piece of her sleeve remained in Arya's hand, who froze in place with shock and horror. After a while, sitting with his daughter in the carriage, Rupert was surprised by Gwen's latest antics. It wasn't long since the princess arrived and so much had already happened. However, Gwen knew that Leona only seemed quiet and calm, which made her simply underestimated by many. Rupert understood this and was worried that such a young princess would have to face so many trials. The Marquise looked thoughtfully out of the window, remembering how, when the guards had captured Arya, she had shouted that the princess had jumped off herself. Gwen didn't understand if this was true. Then how did she come to do this? Suddenly, she turned to her father and asked for a letter of recommendation. Her father was surprised by such an unexpected request, wanting to know why she needed it. As it turned out, the heroine wanted to be accepted as a servant for Her Highness. After a while, the servant reported to Daniel that the princess had woken up. Near the entrance to her room, the hero met a doctor who had just finished examining the girl. After finding out about her condition and learning that it was necessary to avoid exciting topics, the prince immediately went inside the room. Seeing Daniel on the doorstep, Leona greeted him with a joyful smile. Seeing her emaciated body wrapped in bandages, the hero decided that it was better than he expected. The girl found out from him that everyone was very worried about the fact that she had not recovered for several days. The heroine was sorry that she made him worry, but the hero decided that now was not the time to think about him. As it turned out, Daniel had already heard that Arya pushed the princess off a cliff, and the girl wondered what happened to her now. The queen's maid was executed for a crime against the royal family. The most interesting thing for Leona was that the queen herself ordered her to be executed. This meant that she even got rid of her own people to avoid accusations. It was a little surprising that Arya had died so soon, but that wasn't the main problem. The problem will be who will take Miranda's side in the future, and the heroine understood that she would have a hard time. Seeing her loaded face, Daniel calmly exhaled and put his hand on the princess's eyes. He hoped that she would take good care of herself, after which the girl smiled. A short time later, when Leona returned to her castle, she was greeted by new maids, led by Gwen. The Marquise was sure that it was worth it to steal a letter of recommendation from her father. The maids who remained after Arya's death were also moved by Duke Gregory. Gwen wondered if Her Majesty had heard of the new academy in Delica. Leona knew about it only superficially and wanted to clarify if there were any special requirements for admission. The Marquise knew that there was an exam, and many nobles only pretended to take it in order to enter. Leona didn't know how much money an ordinary nobleman was spending on this, but she knew that Gregory could provide huge funds. This means that if the princess opens a fund, she will be able to enlist the support of the Duke directly. The Queen will most likely not interfere, and for Daniel, this will be an opportunity to enter. Inspired by this brilliant idea, Leona asked Gwen to send a letter to the prince's palace. The letter had to indicate that she wanted to see him in the evening to find out something. Later, while waiting for the meeting, the prince realized that other than the time when the princess was injured, they had never really communicated. Suddenly, the door opened and a servant appeared, who informed His Highness of the visitor. Entering, the heroine greeted Daniel, bowing to him in curtsy. The girl wanted to ask a question, but the prince suddenly began to speak, interrupting her. Realizing this, he immediately apologized and prepared to listen carefully to Leona. The heroine only wanted to know if he liked lunch, but the hero decided that it was not worth talking about it. Then Leona changed the subject, considering herself a young foreign princess. Therefore, she wanted to learn more about the relations and history of other countries in order to calm them down as soon as possible. In response, Daniel decided that it would be better to invite scientists, but the girl did not think it was a good idea. She wanted to learn this personally from the prince, at least on a level that would not make her feel embarrassed in front of others. Agreeing, the hero wrote and gave the servant a list of books that he needed to bring. When everything was ready, they sat down, and the prince began to explain about the intricate relations between states and internecine wars. There is an invalid alliance between neighboring duchies, but if the Duke declares that he does not want to give access, it will lead to war. Leona thought that perhaps the prince had only received the missing education in his youth, but now he knew everything better than her. Looking at her thoughtful face, the hero decided that perhaps they should stop for today. Such a volume of information was a lot for one time, and it took time to assimilate everything. At this moment, the prince's maid approached them and brought a small tray of tea. Suddenly, Daniel picked up a small vessel and began to pull something out with tongs. Seeing how he put one small rose in the cups, the heroine found it charming. He had heard that his father would find flowers that had bloomed and put them in his mother's teacup. Leone wondered what the previous queen was like. The prince didn't remember much, knowing only that she was kind and bright. Then the girl decided that the hero had the same heart as hers, but the prince did not consider herself a good person at all. This surprised the princess very much, and she didn't understand why he thought of himself like that. His biggest flaw, Daniel believed, was that he did not know how to forgive, and he also despised himself. The heroine knew that the fault did not lie with him, and she also understood that His Highness also knew this. However, Daniel believed that shifting blame would not change the situation, and dark desires only grow. But even so, the heroine did not want him to allow himself to lose control over her. This was the greatest fear of the prince himself, which she knew very well. But the hero also understood that even if he were in his right mind, he would not be able to surround the girl with the fame that she deserves. Surely she did not mean to say that it would be a greater honor for him not to be a madman? But to his surprise, Leona only wanted to get up and nothing more. She believed that the hatred that had been nurtured sometimes turned into a pushing force. After a pause, the prince decided to think carefully about these words. Looking at him carefully, the heroine understood that this was not what she meant at all. The real meaning of her words was in what the hero cannot yet understand. Sometime later, Leona and Daniel were playing a board game while in the prince's castle. After the end of classes, the heroine began to often come here and spend time with the prince. At first, the hero was very puzzled, but now it seemed that he was used to it. Sometimes when the weather was particularly good, the two of them would go for a walk. Usually, Leona decides what they will do, but today, the hero himself has prepared a board game called Colony. The winner is the one who occupies the most blue or green cells. The rules were very simple, but the girl played it for the first time, so she was defeated in the first 2 rounds. Thinking about where to put the figure, she suddenly saw a strange smile on the prince's face. Daniel was surprised, not understanding why she was being distracted by him during her turn. At this point, Gwen decided to intervene, thinking that Leone should play for the color blue as it brings good luck. Deciding to take note of this, the heroine tried to walk with a figure while clarifying with the prince whether she was doing the right thing. The hero was shocked by her question because he was Leona's opponent, after which she looked at him in bewilderment. The prince moved a little away from the table and covered his mouth with his hand, holding back a burst of laughter. Even though the princess was unconditionally inferior to him, she was glad to see such a sincere smile on his face for the first time. At that moment, Nancy came up and reported to the mistress about the arrival of the queen's new servant, Zara. The heroine gave her permission, and a middle-aged woman entered the room, bowing to the prince and princess. The reason for her visit was that the queen wanted Her Highness Leona to join her. Accepting the invitation with gratitude and understanding, the heroine hurried to leave the prince for a while. But suddenly, the hero refused, deciding that he would take Leona to Miranda. He believed that there was nothing that the queen could say to the princess while hiding it from him. Realizing that Miranda could punish her for his coming, Zara tried to dissuade His Highness from going. In response, he frowned, made a menacing look, and decided that the maid should not forget her place. Following Zara, Leona was not sure that the hero should go and wondered if he remembered her words. Miranda was waiting for them in the large hall and was very surprised that they came together. The prince, who had always run away so quickly, was now standing in front of her. Could it be because of the princess? She reminded them both that His Majesty the King had not regained consciousness for a long time. Therefore, he needed a servant, but the previous one suddenly quit, and now it was necessary to urgently find a replacement. According to the queen, the only person she could entrust with such a responsibility was Leona. Daniel tried to intercede, deciding that the girl was too weak and he himself was ready to take on this responsibility. But suddenly the heroine enthusiastically accepted the queen's order, deciding to make every effort for the sake of the king. Miranda fell into a stupor, thinking that the princess could not be unaware of the situation and was probably thinking of some kind of scheme. Also, the girl tried to justify the prince who was worried about her, and she hoped that Her Highness would not be angry. In fact, there was a moment in Leona's past life when she served the king. It was very difficult because for the slightest mistake, you could lose your life. However, the heroine was fascinated by the breath of the sleeping king, similar to Daniel. Therefore now she gratefully accepted this deed, considering it an honor for herself. These words were very encouraging to Miranda, who thought that there was no point in weaving intrigue in such a situation. She saw that the girl could not do anything, and this encouraged her. While Arya was by her side, the queen did not even notice that all this time someone as useful as Zara was at hand. A little earlier, the maid resolutely approached her with an interesting proposal. Remembering that the court needed a new regent, Zara thought that Princess Leona would be a good fit for the role. After meeting with the princess, the queen notified the servants of the new regent. She sincerely hoped that His Majesty's health would soon recover. In addition, she wondered if the healer was using the drugs he had made for the king correctly. First of all, he needed to allow the court doctors to prescribe the treatment for His Majesty themselves. The queen decided to be cautious, believing that the princess could not be trusted. At this time, walking down the corridor with Leona, the prince did not understand what she was going to do. Seeing his nervousness, the heroine decided to talk to him when he calmed down. First of all, she couldn't understand why he was even worried about it. However, Daniel was just sure that Miranda had ordered her to do it so that she would make a mistake. But Leona was sure that even if she refused, the queen would hardly listen to her. At that moment, it seemed to the prince that she again seemed to know about everything in advance, as she did with the stroller. Courage was a commendable quality, but the hero knew that sometimes it bordered on recklessness. After thanking His Highness for his advice, the girl hurried away. After a while, she finally met the doctor who was supposed to take her to the king. In total, there were 3 court doctors in the palace, who together monitored the sovereign's condition. Miranda bribed them with money and gifts, but only a few people knew about it. And if the doctors hadn't looked down on Leona and gossiped in front of her in a past life, she wouldn't have known it either. Before starting, the doctor decided to instruct the princess, explaining her duties. In particular, she will need to stay by the king's side from morning to evening, pour him water or red soup to help him eat and wipe his back. Interrupting him, the heroine remembered that she would also need to turn His Majesty over every hour and change the bed linen. Judging by the expression on the doctor's face, he was discouraged by the unexpected awareness of the heroine. Leona also decided to clarify whether the king takes a special medicine, but as it turned out, the doctors themselves will give it to the monarch. The heroine was surprised by this turn because in a past life, she had to do it on her own. Since this was the princess's first time, the doctor decided to be present to help if necessary. But Leona was well aware that he was just waiting for her to make a mistake in order to report to the queen. The court doctors reached the heights without any abilities, rubbing themselves into the trust of Miranda. A few days later, Leona noticed that although the king had been ill for several years, his body was incredibly clean. It did not have boils or bed sores, which often occur on the bodies of bedridden patients. It was more like His Highness had just fallen into a long sleep. Over the past few days, the king had been feverish several times, and at this moment, he was muttering something in delirium without coming to his senses. In severe cases, he moaned and screamed in pain, but it quickly passed after taking the medication. The princess didn't know this in her previous life, as she didn't have time to look at him. Suddenly, taking a closer look and opening the king's mouth with her fingers, the heroine saw blue marks inside. At the same moment, the doctor entered the room, looking at the princess with displeasure. He felt that the pillows were too high for a patient who had been lying there for so long. In addition, according to the doctor, the water spoon was too large and needed to be replaced urgently. In response, the girl calmly nodded in agreement and began to correct the voiced shortcomings. The queen ordered the doctor to criticize Leona, but the girl did so well that he began to invent even such absurdities. He remembered that the air in the bedroom was too heavy, so they ventilated and use incense. If the incense burner is overflowing, then using it can harm the king. Therefore, the doctor wanted Leona to take the incense burner, which was a huge vase of ashes, and shake it out. He commanded as if he was talking to a subordinate, but the heroine understood that it was better for her to put up with it. Smiling, she pretended that she could not avoid her duties until His Majesty came to his senses. Seeing how she took the vase with a straight face and carried it to the exit, the doctor was shocked by this poisonous bastard. The incense burner turned out to be incredibly heavy, possibly due to the moisture accumulated in it. Suddenly, someone approached her and shamelessly began to snatch the vase from the girl's hands. The hero thought that such weights should be carried by maids for a princess. Looking at him carefully, the heroine was confused, remembering this man. Leona immediately pretended that everything was fine and she was just doing what she had to do. Knowing that the courtiers don't say that, the hero assumed that perhaps Her Highness was in front of him. The guy was not dressed like a soldier, but even so, the girl was sure that it was him. This bronze hair and sharp gaze were well remembered by her from her past life. The young hero had enough opportunities to become an elite royal guard and died when the Duke's mansion collapsed. He was Gregory's son and Daniel's best friend, named Eric, next to whom the prince was constantly smiling. Leona introduced herself to him, and the hero immediately bowed, greeting Her Highness. He was shocked at how informal the princess was with him. The Duke's family had little influence, due to the tradition of not interfering in the factions' feuds and politics. However, the kingdom was founded on this family, and several queens came from it, including Daniel's mother. Because of this tradition, there was no faction formed around the Duke, but they were the spiritual support of the royalists or middle nobles. Thanks to this, Daniel managed to survive and save his life, and after the death of his mother, Gregory took him to himself. Shortly before meeting the princess, Eric came to see his father. The Duke was very glad that his eldest son had decided to stay here for a few weeks. Moreover, Gregory was dissatisfied with the fact that Eric was at home usually 2 or 3 weeks a year. When Eric saw the documents on his father's desk, he was surprised that his father still preferred to do things on his own. Now it was not surprising why Gregory looked older and older with each arrival of the hero. The Duke was indignant at these words, believing that although he was old, he was still able to compete with even his eldest son. Smiling back, Eric also wanted to know how Daniel was doing and found out that he had already married. This news shocked the hero because he was sure that he had to be invited to the wedding. Upon learning that the queen had canceled the crown prince's marriage ceremony, Eric considered it a mockery on her part. Gregory agreed with his son, but in this situation he could not do anything. Then the hero decided to find out what family the bride was from, because they could not sit silently while their daughter was made fun of. He was very surprised to find out that she was from the Tian Kingdom, which has been waging ridiculous wars for generations. The hero suggested that for sure the girl did not go for it voluntarily, and it was the tricks of the queen. His father understood his feelings and hoped that, as a member of the order, his son would be careful in his words and actions. Eric wanted to know more about the princess Daniel married. What was she like? Gregory thought that the girl would not live up to his expectations, which made the hero confused. Outwardly, the princess seemed very weak, as if she could shudder at a light breath of air. However, compared to what the current King Tien was, the heroine was striking in her wisdom. But she was still very young, so it was necessary to take care of her together with the prince. Eric immediately agreed, and later, standing in the hallway across from Leona, he was surprised at how informal she was with him. He decided to help her shake out the incense burner, not understanding why the princess was doing this. From the mysterious silence in response and the nervous look of the girl, he realized that these were Miranda's tricks again. The thought of the queen trying to use such a puny princess infuriated him. It was raining heavily outside, but despite this, the hero safely came out from under the roof and emptied the vase. Afterwards, he safely returned to Leon, who thanked him, calling him Sir. However, Eric had not yet received such a title and was a simple student, so he was very confused. The heroine was not much surprised by his help, because is it normal that he does the work of maids? Looking at her pretty smile, Eric didn't understand. Was it really better than he thought, or was she just pretending? Escorting the heroine back, the hero found out that the king was still unconscious. It seemed to him as if only yesterday he, Daniel, and his highness had all read books together. However, the royal body became only a shell after the warmth of the former queen had passed, and Daniel, who was like a brother to him, slowly withered away in his position as crown prince. Eric decided to invite the princess to come with him to the prince when he greeted the king at the door. But Leona knew perfectly well that her duties as a servant were not yet over and she had to stay with the king until evening. Eric was shocked by these words, because there must be several other servants besides her taking care of His Highness with her. After telling him all the circumstances, the heroine saw how the guy's face turned red with anger and the veins in his hands pulsated. She hastened to add that there were 3 people besides her who were checking on the sleeping king's condition. Believing that this was absolutely unacceptable, the hero abruptly turned around and headed for His Highness's chambers. At this moment, one of the 3 court doctors was there, sleeping peacefully, sprawled on the sofa. One fierce look from Eric was enough for the old man to come to his senses and wake up. The doctor was furious, not understanding how he dared to do such recklessness in front of His Majesty's bedroom. Seeing the hero with a sword, the doctor realized that he was a certain nobleman, which slightly reduced the ardor of the old man. The doctor decided that, in view of the king's condition, it would be better for him to retire, but the nephew knew his uncle's condition better than the others. Realizing that it was the son of Duke Gregory, the old man stepped back in horror. Eric began to scream furiously, because while the princess did not take care of herself, this bastard lay there comfortably. He immediately ordered the guards to take the criminal to the dungeon and whip him at least 30 times. The doctor began to beg for forgiveness, promising never to neglect his duties again. When he was taken away, the hero apologized to Leone for the fact that this violence took place in front of her eyes. He still insisted that the girl go with him, but the heroine decided to stay with the king, whom no one else could take care of. In addition, she was already grateful to him for his help with hard work, and then Eric decided to call a servant to help her. After that, the hero hurried to meet the prince, who was very surprised to see him. It had been a long time since the friends had last seen each other. Daniel thought that Eric had become even more feral during this time, and his face had completely lost its color. In response, the hero laughed, thinking that His Highness had become even worse since then. Besides, Eric had come to see him because he was worried, but if the prince was rude, he might leave. Daniel shrugged his shoulders, deciding that then he could leave, but the hero thought that the prince was just confused. Smiling, Daniel noticed that Eric had grown a lot, and as it turned out, it was the food of the training camp. If the prince had known in advance about the appearance of the duke's son, he would have had time to prepare and make a more abundant dinner. However, Eric spent 2 days in the family mansion and, under the guidance of his caring mother, ate a year's supply of food. The hero thought that it looked like they were going to sell their naughty son for meat for soup. Continuing the conversation at the table, Eric remembered that today he stopped near the king's bedroom and saw Her Highness. And he was very surprised that she did all the work herself, without assistance. Hearing this, Daniel's face changed dramatically and looked at the hero in bewilderment. Meanwhile, Leona sat next to His Highness and checked his mouth again. The blue deposits in his mouth still hadn't gone away, which was very strange. The girl had never heard of an ailment that had such an effect before. It must have been because of the herbs, and if she could find out about them, she might be able to wake up the king. Lost in thought, she did not hear the doctor calling out to her, and he suddenly entered the room. The doctor did not understand why the girl did not respond to his call, but as it turned out, she was just enthusiastically serving His Majesty. Also, he could not find a second doctor, and then the heroine admitted that it was better for them to look for someone to replace. After all, not long ago, the doctor was sleeping peacefully on the sofa right in front of the king's bedroom, after which soldiers burst in and dragged him away. The doctor was shocked by his colleague, who would not even be able to report this to the queen now, as the situation was stupid as it could be. Then he simply decided to finish the rest on his own, giving the girl a well-deserved rest. Leona returned to her room and was immediately met by Gwen, who hurried to her mistress. The maid was shocked at how firm her shoulders were, probably from hard work. She was happy to inform the princess that Duke Eric had visited her and invited the heroines to dinner at the prince's palace. Later, while preparing the heroine for the meeting, Gwen wondered if they should wear pearl jewelry. Leonie didn't care, but the maid knew that the princess wasn't as interested in these things as she was. Gwen recalled that her nanny and mother were very happy when she started looking at the jewelry. Leone was not at all indifferent to how she looked, she just did not understand it at all. She doesn't care if she's not as pretty as a beautiful flower, so she was willing not to be attractive this time either. However, despite this, the heroine intended to be the one who would crown Daniel, as well as hand him a sharp sword and make him swing it. Meanwhile, Daniel heard from Eric that the princess looked like she would crumble at the slightest breath. The so-called doctor forces Her Highness to empty the incense burner, although it is very heavy. At this moment, the prince had a look on his face as if he didn't care, which greatly surprised the Duke. Rubbing his lips with his fingers, Daniel decided to clarify whether the hero helped her, and he was glad to receive a positive answer. Moreover, Eric ordered the scoundrel to be whipped 30 times, which would surely make him lose consciousness. At this point, the prince recalled that when he tried to help, Leona stubbornly refused. Suddenly, the Duke jumped up from his seat and invited His Highness to take a walk in the backyard. The weather was just great, and the hero was sure that Daniel could not just stay in his room because they had not seen each other for so long. Upon learning that the purpose of the walk was to spend 2 rounds of swords, the prince's face drooped, which greatly surprised Eric. Laughing, the Duke decided that the prince was afraid of upsetting the heroine if she saw their duel. But even so, the hero insisted on his own, believing that it would stir up the prince, who moves so little. Later, as they approached His Highness's palace, the girls were very surprised to hear the sounds of a sword fight. At that moment, Eric successfully blocked Daniel's lunge and prepared to counterattack. However, the prince parried the enemy's counterattack, confusing him. As Daniel was about to strike again, he suddenly saw Gwen and Leona approaching. At the same moment, Eric rushed to attack, and at the last moment, the prince managed to block it. Seeing this unexpected lunge from the Duke and the lightning-fast defense from His Highness, the girls gasped at the same time. The prince was distracted by this, and taking advantage of the moment, Eric instantly disarmed him. Immediately afterward, the Duke also discovered the arrival of the ladies, greeting them. Daniel knew that the battle might not have noticed their arrival, so he hoped they wouldn't stay here for long. Leona froze in place, staring at the prince, which greatly disturbed Gwen. Coming close to the heroine, the prince decided to find out what exactly happened to her. The girl pretended that everything was fine, but Daniel could see for sure that there was something wrong with her. At this moment, the Duke noticed a sword on the maid's belt, thinking that it was decorative. Meanwhile, Leona noticed that both characters were sweating a lot, and perhaps it would be better for them to freshen up before dinner. Eric thought it would be better to use something more subtle and colorful than a sword as a decoration. In addition, its hilt was too rough and did not fit Gwen's dress. At the same moment, the blade of the servant's sword rested on his neck as proof of authenticity. Leona screamed in horror, shocked by what was happening, and ran to the girl. At this moment, Eric wondered if the Marquise was too impatient. Putting away the sword, Gwen decided that knowing the names of even the most insignificant families did honor to the young Duke. Before entering the training center, the hero had already heard stories about the family of Rupert's daughter, who had a fiery character. Gwen apologized for her joke, considering it a great honor to satisfy Eric's curiosity. In addition, she knew that her actions must have surprised the princess very much. The heroine did not understand why she would do this, but the maid just wanted to show that the sword was real. Not looking at it closely, the Duke decided that the sword was decorative, only because she was a young lady. Leona hoped that Gwen would be more careful, but the girl understood that the princess also needed to be careful in her words. Not long ago, it looked like Daniel was worried about why she hadn't said a word. However, it was the first time Leona had seen the prince so happy and with such a joyful smile on his face. Before that, she could not even imagine him happy and did not know how to say and how to look into his face. Gwen was sure that in the future, the princess would often see the prince like this. The heroine was stupefied by these words, not knowing if she could make Daniel happy. Originally, she was going to make him king, even if it didn't bring him happiness. However, if you put him on the throne and put a diamond crown on his head, but he is not happy, is that a success? Thinking about this, the heroine decided to ask the maid what could make Daniel happy. The girl did not expect such a question, deciding that it would be better to ask the prince himself. She was embarrassed that she, like Leona, was not good at the science of men's hearts, but Gwen decided to show her loyalty. Thinking that she would now study the matter diligently, she suddenly heard that the princess agreed with her. Leona was grateful, believing that perhaps everything would really be resolved if she just asked. Delighted, Gwen was shocked that her advice was able to help. After a while, the friends finally gathered at the same table. The heroes wondered if it was not difficult for the princess to bear such a burden, but she was only worried about the king's poor health. She also wanted to know if the Duke or the Marquise knew any legislator. If there were good private legislators, she would be glad to hear their advice. After a while, she was again courting His Highness, when suddenly a doctor came bringing medicines with him. It turned out to be a new doctor who replaced the whipped, and he wanted to personally give the medicine to the king. He did not allow the girl to help prepare the potion or simply give it to the monarch, and the medicine itself was strange, if only because it had no smell at all. Of course, there are odorless remedies for some patients, but for the emotionless king, it was pointless. The heroine, to her surprise, could not remember anything similar from the known potions. When her mother was still alive, Leona learned how to make many herbal medicines. She sniffed out all the herbs that were said to benefit the body. The princess was also surprised that the process of preparing the potion took place in the kitchen. Vaguely digging into her memory, she managed to find the place where the medicine for the king was prepared. Leona understood that if the decoction was already cooked, it should be used, but all the flasks were absolutely clean. Soon the palace doctor was to come, and it was necessary to hurry and find it sooner than he did. But it was even more important to have time to return, because if she was caught like this, then everything would be over, and there would be no more opportunity to try her luck. Taking a step, the heroine suddenly heard a strange knocking coming from the floor. As she crouched, she felt where she had stepped and found that the slab was rising. Under the stove, there was a space in which there was a small bag of medicine. Suddenly, the door to the room opened and a doctor appeared on the threshold who looked at the princess with horror. He began to furiously demand an explanation of what the heroine was doing here alone. Leona pretended to come here for water and dropped her brooch, so she was just looking for it. But the doctor did not calm down, realizing that the princess would not go to the kitchen to drink water. Then, making an angry look, the heroine was outraged that she had to listen to the doctor's scolding because of such a trifle. She thought that serving His Majesty meant showing loyalty to the country, so she turned a blind eye to many things. But how could a simple palace doctor show such disrespect to the princess? He is so carefree of her, but how much greater is his laziness and disrespect for a king who doesn't even know it? Hearing that he and the king were not the same thing, the doctor felt a strong desire to kill this girl. However, the queen was already angry because of the last court hearing, and if he got too excited, he could end up like the previous doctor. The heroine began to call the guards, and at that moment, the doctor fell to his knees in front of her. Banging his forehead on the floor, he admitted his mistake, and also considered his words and actions unceremonious, promising not to do it again. Beating his forehead to a large bruise, he began to beg for forgiveness and also intended to help the princess find the brooch. But the girl decided to find her herself, not wanting someone like this to touch her. Glancing at the doctor coldly, she didn't understand why he hadn't left yet. At the same moment, the angry but powerless doctor left the kitchen, slamming the door. Leona immediately fell to the floor, actively searching for a cache of medicine for the king. After finally finding it, she sincerely hoped that it could be the key. Technically hiding the bag in the sleeve of her dress, the heroine hurried to leave the kitchen. On his way to the queen, the doctor was beside himself with anger that this bastard had dared to speak to him like that. He was just waiting for the moment when Leona would make a mistake, for which he would immediately pay. With that, he walked into Miranda's throne room, greeting Her Highness. First of all, she wanted to know what His Majesty's condition was. The doctor reported that the king had taken the medicine as he should, but Miranda wondered how the princess was doing. At this moment, the doctor hesitated hesitately, starting to mumble something indistinctly. The queen was angered by this, and he immediately admitted that Her Highness was doing her duties well. The queen was surprised that the girl was so flawless that even an experienced doctor could not find a flaw in her work. Then Miranda wondered if the doctor had dared to lie to her. The hero immediately began to deny it, because he would never dare to do such a thing. But the queen wanted to hear where he got such a bruise on his forehead. The doctor's body shook terribly, and he pretended that he was only trying to pick up a fallen spoon. Doubting the sincerity of this answer, the queen ordered him to get out of her sight immediately. She didn't understand what was bothering her, and it was hard for her to have to rely on this old man. And most of all, Miranda was annoyed by the fact that now it was dangerous to change something and she just had to wait, relying on fate. After a while, one very hot day, Leona arrived at Daniel's palace by invitation. The prince's personal servant, named Ben, greeted the mistress, wanting to accompany her to Daniel. The girl thought that perhaps something had happened to the prince, but the servant was sure that everything was fine with His Highness. As they walked, Ben kept looking back at the princess, which surprised her a little. Upon learning that Daniel was in the back garden, the heroine decided to follow on herself, letting the servant go about her business. Leona was confused because the prince had called her to the back garden for the first time. Looking after her, the servant wondered how she could be so beautiful. Meanwhile, Daniel could not find a place for himself from the inner tension that gripped him. Not long ago, Eric had thought that His Highness was an incredibly gloomy person. The hero understood that the prince could not fix the situation, but he could force himself to cheer up. And if the Duke realizes that he cannot solve this problem, he will force Daniel to come to his senses, even though the Duke does not have a relationship. After all, if he were in the prince's place, he certainly would not just watch his wife walk around exhausted and lonely. Therefore, Eric advised His Highness to take the princess by the hand and take a short walk. And now, standing in the garden, Daniel wasn't quite sure if everything would be all right if he just relied on the Duke's words. Immersed in these thoughts, he noticed Leona approaching at the last moment. On Eric's advice, he put his hand forward, inviting the girl to take a short walk in the garden. For a few seconds, she froze in shock, after which, laughing embarrassedly, the heroine accepted the offer. As they walked, Leona watched the prince, who seemed to be in a fog. Daniel knew that today was hotter than ever, and it was probably hard for the princess too. Deciding that in such weather it would be pleasant to eat something cool and sweet, the hero made ice cream. Sitting at a table in the gazebo, the heroine felt an atmosphere of awkwardness in the air. For a few minutes they sat in complete silence, enjoying the sweetness, and Leona felt the prince's gaze on her. Unable to stand it, she decided to clarify whether His Highness had something to say. A little embarrassed, the hero made an unexpected confession that the princess reminded him of a bird. Seeing the puzzled expression on the girl's face, Daniel pretended that he had made a mistake. Instead, he decided to find out if everything was fine with her duties as a servant. Smiling in confusion, the girl thought that she was doing quite well so far. However, the princess wondered why the prince did not visit His Highness. As it turned out, the reason was the queen's ban, and it had been several years since Daniel had seen his father. Leona didn't understand if there was a reason why Miranda would forbid anyone from visiting an unconscious king. Deciding to continue this topic, she remembered that she was surprised by the incredible resemblance of the king and the prince. First of all, they were similar in the shape of the chin and the shape of the eyes. Prior to this, Daniel had often heard that he looked very much like his mother, and was the first time anyone had compared him to a king. First of all, it was because he had inherited his mother's characteristic red hair color. Suddenly, the heroine understood why the queen did not allow the prince to visit her father. After all, if His Majesty comes to his senses and sees Daniel, who looks so much like his mother, then no one knows what will happen. Then she became curious about what the previous queen looked like, and Leona wanted to look at her portrait. A portrait of the king hangs in the main hall of the palace, but she has never seen a single portrait of the former queen. After a short silence, Daniel sadly admitted that there was not a single portrait of his mother left in the palace. When the current queen came to power, she burned all the portraits of the previous queen, who died due to illness. The prince wanted to keep at least one, but he didn't have the heart to do so, which made the girl confused. Perhaps in the family of Duke Gregory, her childhood portrait remained, and if the heroine wanted it, Daniel was ready to ask for it. At this moment, the girl thought about how much pain the prince had endured, and whether she could take even a tiny part of his suffering. Seeing that she was almost crying, the hero thought that this was due to the lack of a portrait of his mother. But it turned out to be about him, and the prince carefully handed the princess a handkerchief. Accepting him with gratitude, the heroine thought that she should take care of him, but all she does is receive care. After a while, when she was with the king, a doctor suddenly appeared, who was frantically looking for a colleague. He had no time at all to give the king medicine because he had to hurry to the banquet. He wanted to transfer this responsibility to a colleague, but not finding him, he decided to turn to Leone as an exception. As the girl had already sufficiently familiarized herself with everything, the doctor hoped that she would not refuse to give His Majesty medicine. Until then, Leona had feared that it would be impossible to find a trace in the herbs, but now that she took the medicine, she would be able to pinpoint the ingredients. Deciding that it would be possible to change the dosage and bring the king to his senses, she happily agreed. After thanking her and instructing her, the doctor went to the exit, when suddenly the girl called out to him. The princess wanted to know what herbs this tincture was made of. The doctor was very puzzled by her question, not understanding why Her Highness would know this. Then she pretended that she was weak as a child and took a lot of medicines, but for the first time, she felt such a smell. When Leona was told that the potion had been made exclusively for the king, Leona thanked the doctor, finding out what she wanted. After that, the doctor immediately left her, leaving the heroine wondering if there was a better way. Shaking the monarch by the shoulder as before, there was no reaction. Bringing the medicine to his mouth, she begged His Majesty to open his eyes in Daniel's name. Over the next few days, Leona searched the kitchen more than once, but nothing else could be found. Even when she rechecked that hiding place in the floor, it was empty. It seems that the queen has become even more attentive, so she had to be even more careful. Most of all, it seemed strange that Miranda still leaves the monarch alive. Thinking that it is necessary to wake him up before Miranda commits a murder, the heroine suddenly gets lost. Realizing that she had simply left the palace through another entrance, the girl decided to return as soon as possible. Suddenly, a woman's voice was heard from the side, begging to let her go. Turning around, Leona saw Tyler, who was openly harassing a young girl. She and Miranda's son looked at the princess in surprise, not expecting her to appear there. Pushing Tyler away, the girl curtsied to greet the princess, introducing herself as Patricia. Leona knew that this woman was rumored to be Miranda's son's mistress, even before his coming-of-age ceremony. Her father tried to make a princess out of his daughter in this way, which later became a big mistake. After greeting Patricia and Tyler, the heroine hurried to leave them. Suddenly, the hero approached and, putting his hand on the girl's shoulder, decided that she could stay for a while. Of course, it was not difficult, but such a duty was unpleasant for the princess. Tyler didn't understand why she was saying that because it was so upsetting to him. If he had nothing else to say, then the heroine wanted to go on business, but the hero wanted to tell her a lot. Turning to Patricia, he told her to wait a little, which greatly angered the girl. Then the hero thought that she could return for today, which left Patricia in a stupor. Angry, she threw a furious glance at Tyler and then quickly left. Looking at her, Leona was sure that the hero should follow her. But Tyler was calm, because later she would start sticking like a leech again, wanting to achieve a marriage proposal. In any case, the princess wanted the hero to immediately remove his hand from her shoulder. Tyler did not understand if his older brother really had such taste, because according to rumors, he only liked obedient wives. Showing disgust with all her appearance, the heroine considered it a simple exaggeration. Tyler wanted the girl to be frank with him because surely his brother married her, not because of great love. Leona knew that someone might be walking nearby, so she shouldn't quarrel with him now. The hero began to say something about Daniel again, and the girl at this time tried to remain calm. At this moment, she involuntarily remembered scenes from her past life when this bastard abused her. Suddenly, Tyler casually threw off her cloak, causing the heroine to have a fit of rage. Just thinking that he was going to kill him, a fist suddenly appeared and slammed into the hero's face. Completely taken aback by the surprise, Tyler flew aside in front of the princess, who was no less dumbfounded. Turning her head, the girl saw Daniel's face full of anger and disgust. He began to slowly approach his brother, who began to back away in terror. The prince continued to beat the scoundrel until Eric finally calmed him down. Tyler, with a pretty swollen face, wondered how this bastard dared to touch him. He thought that apparently the prince really wanted his death. Then Eric stood up for Daniel, putting Tyler in his place, and he promised to complain to his mother. He especially threatened the Duke, intending to cut off his head for threatening the royal family. Leona stared at all this with her mouth agape, confused by what was happening. Suddenly, she felt bad, and the heroine began to lose consciousness, terrifying the prince. He tried to bring her back to her senses, but the princess fainted in his arms. A little later, Eric could hardly restrain Gwen, who was ready to hang the scoundrel on the walls of the castle. The Duke himself was happy to feed him to the fish, but if he quarreled with the royal family, it could end in tragedy. At this time, the doctor finished examining Leona and concluded that she was simply shocked. The girl assured that everything was fine with her, but on the advice of the doctor, the prince prepared her tea with mint. Taking the cup, the heroine barely held it in her shaking hands, taking a sip with difficulty. Realizing that she was not able to drink now, Leona decided to finish drinking a little later. She was terrified of what might happen and what would follow. In any case, the rumor will reach the queen, and it is not known what she will do to Daniel, hiding behind what happened. The heroine did not understand what to do, because even Patricia's testimony would not be a good defense. Seeing her condition, the prince gently took the princess's hands, believing that there was nothing to worry about. Leona wondered why he did this, because Daniel had never done anything. The hero admitted that he could tolerate any disrespect for himself, but it was a completely different matter. The princess wondered, after Tyler raped her in a past life, if Daniel really tried to kill him. She also didn't understand if the prince from her previous life and this one were the same person. Knowing that she would never get an answer to this question, tears involuntarily flowed from Leona's eyes. Daniel immediately began to comfort her, but the girl decided that she would not cry. Meanwhile, having recovered from the beatings, with his head wrapped, Tyler went to his mother. According to the doctor, nothing serious had happened to him, but Miranda did not care. Tyler desperately blamed his older brother for everything, shouting insults at him. Looking at him, the queen knew that the snot's resentment had prevailed over him. She was beside herself that Daniel and Eric were able to raise their hand against someone higher than them in status. In addition, Miranda tried to think about her son's reckless statements and actions, but even she found it difficult to endure. Therefore, she really wanted her son not to leave the palace for a while. The queen wanted to tear out Eric's tongue, but she knew that the duke would not accept it. Gregory was the only duke who was allowed to have his own soldiers, so it was problematic to start a war. In addition, he can protest against Eric's punishment. The next day, the duke was shocked by his son's story, refusing to believe him. In Gregory's opinion, Daniel was not one of those who could attack a person like that. Eric knew it was hard to believe, but he saw it for himself and felt relieved. However, his father believed that there was nothing to be happy about, because if this was the case, then the queen would not miss it. Apparently, it was Tyler's fault, and even if the duke tried to cover it up, his son could still be prosecuted. At this time, a servant reported the arrival of the captain of the knightly order to Eric. As it turned out, his goal was to announce the order of the queen, the morning star of Rotera. Eric, the son of Duke Gregory, committed the heinous crime of attacking a member of the royal family while in the retinue of another. Therefore, from this moment, all rights and obligations as a member of the order are completely removed from him. Looking at the hero carefully, the captain of the knights noted how well he held his face. Then Gregory demanded to know what he meant by that. According to the captain, those who do not have dignity or peace cannot wear the knight's mark on their shoulder, even if they have skills. If Eric lost his temper, the commander would have to stop him anyway, even if the opportunity presented itself. Then the duke remarked that such words would not please the queen, but the captain thought that knights did not grovel before those in power. Gregory understood that this was also said, most likely by order of the queen, since knights were her favorite pawns. Looking coldly at the duke, the commander decided that they were serving Rotero, and Rotere was now the queen. Gregory was sure that if knights swore allegiance to the queen out of fear of power, it would only be because of obedience to the king. The commander of the knights began to suspect that the duke might be guessing something, but decided not to take it into account. As he was leaving, he also said that the hero's luggage would arrive in the near future. After a while, Eric met with Daniel and told him about everything that had happened. Blaming himself for everything, the prince apologized for a long time and decided that he would try to somehow return the hero to the status of a knight. He was even about to fall on his knees in front of his mother, after which Eric shouted furiously at him. The young duke did not understand whether the royal heir would be on his knees. The prince had to endure such humiliation that they would not touch him when he regained his rights. Therefore, first of all, Daniel had to maintain his dignity because Duke Gregory favored him. Realizing that by kneeling before Miranda, he would disgrace the entire duke's family, the prince again apologized. Deciding that enough with an apology for today, Eric found out from Daniel that Leona had returned to her chambers very early. Recently, she had asked the duke about the doctor, and now the hero wanted to discuss something with her face to face. Going to her, Eric wanted the prince to stay where he was and think about his behavior. After a while, Leona and Gwen were sitting at a table when Nancy came up and announced the arrival of the Duke's heir. Having received permission, Eric entered them, greeting the princess with a bow. He was a little embarrassed that he had come unannounced, but Leona thought it was okay and invited him to sit down with them. The hero decided to start right away with the fact that if the girl is thinking of starting to apologize, then let her forget about it. After all, he had just made Daniel not do it with difficulty, and besides, Eric himself believed that he could cope with any state of affairs. However, the heroine still considered herself guilty, which caused a wave of frantic rage to sweep over Gwen again. The warrior was sure that if anyone was to blame, it was only this pathetic snot Tyler. The princess really wanted to know why the Duke had come to see her in person. This was due to her recent request, and the hero managed to find out from the doctor that the herbs found were called Olivia. Leona had never heard of such a herb in Tien and wondered what it was. In fact, Eric was not surprised by her ignorance and even doubted it himself, because this was the name of an ancient legend. Legend has it that in ancient times there was a king of the north who sent 30 of his sons to a rich southern kingdom. The king of the south had 30 beautiful daughters, and the king of the north married his sons to them to form an alliance. However, the king of the south did not want his daughters to marry the rude northern princes. Therefore, accepting the offer of the king of the north, he ordered his daughters to kill their husbands on their wedding night. 29 daughters followed his instructions, but the youngest princess, Olivia, fell in love with her husband and was unable to kill him. Instead, she used poison to fake his death and fled with him before dawn. Upon arriving north, hiding from the king's pursuit, Olivia tried to wake her husband. However, the prince did not come to his senses in any way, and then she decided that he was dead. After that, she died in his arms, all in tears from inconsolable grief. When the prince recovered from the poison and came to his senses, he realized that Olivia, who had kept him alive, had died, and at that moment he was so trampled by grief that his whole body froze and fell to pieces. To this day, it is rumored that it is always so cold in the north because of the scattered ice crystals. Therefore, everyone believes that this plant can cause a deep sleep, and it is also very expensive and not available to anyone. In addition, you need to be very careful and use it in very small doses. Eric also heard that if you take it for too long, blue dots will appear in your mouth. Having confirmed her version, the heroine remembered that according to Gwen, these herbs have a unique and pungent smell before drying. But when they are dried and ground, the smell disappears completely, as in the case of royal medicines. In other words, His Majesty was not sick, but was in oblivion because of the medicine. Eric was furious, believing that this should not be left like this, and Gwen was shocked that the Queen had managed to hide it for so many years. This, in turn, meant that everything said by the court doctors was completely controlled by her. Then the Duke hurried to tell his father everything, because no matter how great the Queen's power was, she would not be able to escape from this. But Gwen knew that even if the doctors were silent, things might have leaked out in a different way, so Miranda had to be prepared. And if Eric is not careful, the duchy may suffer for the Queen's false accusations. Leona saw no reason to worry because the herb was non-toxic, and the longer you take it, the weaker the effect. Because of this feature, in order to maintain the effect of the drug, it was necessary to constantly increase the dosage. And vice versa, if it is reduced, then the patient's condition should improve significantly. However, it was not so easy to stop giving this medicine because it is almost impossible to do it unnoticed. The only thing that could be done was to replace the medicine with water a couple of times, but the princess considered it risky. Suddenly, Nancy came up with the idea of using an ordinary cloth to absorb some liquid. Everyone liked this idea very much, but there was one moment that haunted Leon in any way. If Miranda could poison the king for so long, why did she keep him alive for so long? Meanwhile, the Queen was having tea with the noble ladies, who were glad to hear that Prince Tyler had recovered. One of them was so shocked by the news of his beating that she could not even finish the meal. They also admired Her Highness, whose health was undermined while caring for her son. The ladies were delighted that Miranda solved both the big and small issues of the empire, but hoped that she also found time for rest. Also, knowing how much she cared for Tyler, the ladies thought that if he had a princess, the Queen would be calmer. In addition, the prince has already reached the quite mature age of 16, when he can get married. Miranda thoughtfully began to move the spoon along the bottom of the cup, and the ladies suddenly decided that the choice of the princess should be approached with all caution. At this age, all girls are no different from an expensive trinket, so you need to choose someone from the prestigious Rotera family. Miranda, in turn, thought that all the women Tyler touched were excluded, as well as families of titles below Viscount. Hearing that the queen had agreed to think about marrying the prince, the ladies' faces immediately changed. That evening, after tea, all the ladies hurried to their homes. Forcing their daughters to urgently wear all the most expensive and beautiful things, they planned to make a new princess out of them. A little later, Zara reported to the queen that all clothing stores were jam-packed and only the most expensive outfits were ordered. Peacefully enjoying a glass of wine, Miranda had no intention of giving up the power to control people. A few days later, the king was still lying in bed, and the heroine continued to take care of him. All this time, she avoided unnecessary attention and put away the medicine, but His Highness still did not come to his senses. Leona didn't know what she was doing wrong. Maybe something was slipping out of her sight? What if it turns out that it was really not poisoning but an ordinary disease? Unwittingly, memories of a past life began to flash through her mind when Daniel was imprisoned. One day, when the princess was once again immersed in these thoughts, Nancy was horrified by her lost appearance. As it turned out, the maid had already called out to her several times, as the palace guard was waiting for the girl outside to escort her to His Majesty. Wiping away her tears and pretending that everything was fine, the heroine smiled and went to the king. In the last 5 days, she had poured out more than half of the entire medicine. Besides, the doctor didn't look much today, so she didn't give the king much decoction, but he never came to his senses. Leona tried to reassure herself that only a few days had passed. While she was once again struggling with her thoughts, a faint rustle came from the direction of the monarch's bed. Suddenly, she saw the king move his hands a little, and then finally opened his eyes. The girl immediately rushed to the king, but abruptly came to her senses, deciding not to make too much noise. First of all, Leona introduced herself to His Majesty and decided that it would be better for him to continue pretending to be asleep. The king was very surprised to hear that she was the wife of his son Daniel. The princess wanted him to lower his voice a little, because no one should know about his awakening. The ruler wanted to get up and eat on the bed, but Leona thought that he had been lying motionless for too long. But the king insisted, and the girl helped him to sit up neatly, leaning on the headboard. He again began to be surprised that his son had already married, and then the heroine admitted that she was the princess of the Tien Kingdom. It had been a very long time since the king had fallen asleep again, which caused his head to work very poorly. He did not understand why the princess cared for him, and as it turned out, it was an errand from the queen. The girl had something to tell him urgently, and she hoped that the king would believe her. However, in her heart, she kept asking herself if she could tell the king now. Would he believe her words, because Leona had no connections, and her own family did not listen to her? She understood that if he did not believe and went to court, then everything would end very quickly. Seeing her confusion, the king decided that everything would be fine, and prepared to listen to her carefully. Gathering her strength, the heroine admitted that the reason for his sleep was not an illness at all, and what he was taking was not a cure. It was a decoction of the Olivia plant, which could cause fainting even in the smallest doses. As Leona was about to say that it was the queen's doing, she suddenly heard that the king had decided to clarify her name. Nodding in response, the girl was shocked by his calm reaction, as if the king was not surprised at all. Suddenly, the monarch wanted the girl to pull out the third drawer of the chest of drawers and pull a small string. As he had ordered, Leona found something wrapped in paper and tied with thread. Opening the wrapper, the girl, to her surprise, saw a portrait of the former queen. The king looked at his wife with joy, remembering that he had painted this portrait himself. The heroine was very surprised to see how much she looked like Daniel. When the prince was still a baby, His Highness had often heard such words. As it turned out, the king knew that the palace doctor did not give him medicine, which confused Leona. At this moment, the monarch remembered how happily he and his beloved spent time in the palace garden. The main answer to the question of why he allowed all this was that the king simply did not want to wake up. He could not open his eyes in a world where there was no old queen. Sometime after her death, a butler came to His Highness. The servant was concerned that the king had not eaten for several days and was destroying himself. Everyone understood that state affairs were very important, but it was necessary to visit the prince at least once. The monarch was angry with him, thinking that now is there really no time to worry about such things as state things? After the queen's death, he tried to forget his pain, leaving everything else behind, even his own son. Even knowing how Miranda had bullied Daniel, he couldn't just step back. Leona thought this choice was incredibly stupid and thought that the old queen would never accept it. But the king was sure that he knew much more about the late queen than she did. The princess could not calm down, trying to understand why the monarch did not think about the eldest son, who was doomed to suffer. The prince still did not know that his father had woken up and Leona wanted the king to meet him. However, the monarch did not want this, believing that he was unworthy to stand in front of this child. Terrified, the girl screamed, because if everything continued like this, the prince could die. She began to tearfully beg the king to save her son, born to the former queen. But the monarch did not understand why she cared so much about him and what exactly did the heroine want to do with the prince. First of all, she wanted to send His Highness to the new Imperial Academy. And when the time comes and he returns, the prince will certainly prove the firmness of his position. At this moment, Leona would like to place the iron epaulets on his shoulders, as well as lift the jade cup behind him. The princess has not yet told Daniel this, and if he refuses, she will beg him in tears. However, even the king understood that the queen and her power were not so easy to cope with, and was the girl still going to do it? Anyway, the only thing Leona was sure of was that she would do it. At that moment, the monarch remembered that his beloved had once uttered the same words. Later, Daniel and Eric practiced archery while discussing the latest military news. Suddenly, the prince heard footsteps and turned around to see Princess Leona approaching. Seeing her tear-stained look, Daniel wanted to know what had happened to her. Hurriedly wiping her eyes, she pretended that everything was fine. She also wanted to say something to His Highness in private, so she wanted Eric to leave them for a while. The hero was a little taken aback by such secrecy, but there was nothing to do, and he obediently left, squinting suspiciously at the prince. Meanwhile, Tyler was selecting brides who came to his palace. The girls vied with each other to admire the prince, considering him very courageous and personable. However, Tyler himself did not like any of them, and he looked contemptuously at those present. He didn't understand why there were so many women gathered here who were spineless, mean, and arrogant, talking idly. From these words, the queen again had a migraine, and she decided to stop the show for today. She was shocked by the prince, who seemed to deliberately not hear her words. However, Tyler couldn't understand why Miranda was turning down Patricia. But the queen did not want to see as a princess, the daughter of an ordinary count. The prince understood that if she continued to look for the most decent one, then he would end his life with a boring and ugly wife. This angered Miranda because in order to ascend the throne, her son had to obey her unquestioningly. She decided to take care of everything herself, and Tyler could relax and just wait for now. In just a few days, more than a dozen girls came, but none came up. So many people flattered the queen, and everyone was sure that it was his daughter who would become the princess. It was a problem, and it was necessary to find a daughter from a modest family, in which they would not even dare to think about it. Suddenly she noticed Zara standing next to her and confessed to her that the prince was too good. The queen pretended to think of it and remembered that the maid had a daughter too. And although quite a few ladies from families had already come, Miranda wanted to see her daughter as well. Later, the maid's husband was delighted that finally their family would live well, and the daughter was no longer a burden. But Zara, on the contrary, was terrified because everyone knows what a scoundrel Prince Tyler was. Unable to withstand such impudence, the man hit her, believing that the day of a carefree life was about to come. And if the woman interfered for no reason, then he was ready to finish her off himself. At this time, their daughter sat locked in a room, gathered in a ball on the floor, and with tears hoping that everything was for the best. Meanwhile, the heroine confessed to Gregory that she wanted to send Daniel to the Academy of the Delic Empire. Also, as it turned out, this was confirmed personally by the king, which caused the Duke to fall into a stupor. Asking him not to make any noise, the girl apologized for her rudeness, coming to him secretly from Eric. First of all, she decided to tell him in detail about the meeting with His Majesty. After listening to her story, Gregory was furious at the actions of this shameless woman. The princess understood his rage, but they had no way to act now. The Duke was sure that if they told everyone about it, no one would be able to stand aside. But Leona knew that it was impossible for Miranda to do something like this without thinking of an escape route. In addition, the first person to think about in this situation was Daniel. The most important thing for his admission was the entrance fee, and it was also necessary to have a documentary request. A copy of the document had to be obtained through Gwen, but it had to be delivered to the Empire as soon as possible. The Duke decided to deal with it on his own, still perplexed by the King's awakening. Daniel didn't know anything yet, and while the Duke was busy with the paperwork, she would arrange a secret meeting between the King and the Prince. Anyway, Gregory was a little confused and worried that the Prince still didn't know anything. Then he wondered what the Princess planned to do if the Prince refused to leave for the Empire. If Daniel didn't have a future, then she had no reason to live, but she counted on him not to betray her trust. He would probably be shocked or even angry, but if Leona begged, Daniel would agree. Therefore, the heroine did not care how. She was just sure that she could persuade the prince. After a while, the King's health quickly recovered, and thanks to the lazy valet, he managed to get good food. Seeing the worry in the King's eyes, Leona assumed that perhaps His Highness was nervous. Everything was fine. He was just a little worried before meeting his own child. The heroine knew it would be tonight, as the doctor would be leaving to attend her daughter's birthday party. When the halls are empty, Duke Gregory will send most of the soldiers, ostensibly to search for a suspicious person. It would be a great opportunity to come here with Daniel, disguised as servants. The girl wondered what the king would do if the queen demanded serious action from him. The monarch was ready to do whatever his late wife asked. He wondered if the young princess believed in love, which made Leona confused. She was sure that Daniel didn't love her, which caused a smile on the king's face. The girl did not know what love was, and believed that the prince was just worried and took care of her. According to the monarch, everyone perceived love in their own way. Besides, how to understand if feelings change over time? A short time later, Daniel came at the invitation of Duke Gregory. The prince had no plans today, and he looked listlessly at the beginning of the sunset. Suddenly, Leona walked in, holding a servant's robes in her hands, and the Duke stood up abruptly. Gregory went to the exit, and the girl approached the puzzled prince, wanting to tell him everything. Daniel had a very uncomprehending look, but she hoped that he would just listen to her silently. Upon learning that His Majesty had come to his senses, the prince almost fell to the floor from surprise and shock. He couldn't believe it, and asked the girl to repeat her words, which she did. Looking desperately at her, the hero wanted to know the details of what had happened to his father. However, there was no time for that now, and there was a need to hurry, so the princess had prepared the servant's clothes in advance. She decided to help him change his clothes, but the prince suddenly stopped her, leaving her confused. Daniel didn't understand why she hadn't told him sooner, but the girl knew that there were eyes and ears against the walls here. The prince thought that, in fact, the heroine never says anything to him. Because of this, he couldn't even imagine what she thought of him. The girl was surprised, thinking that the prince would just put up with it, follow and trust. She swore revenge on Miranda for the sake of her own happiness and the well-being of those around her. And now Leona seems to be very sorry that she did not think at all about what he feels. However, this time she just wanted him to trust, because the heroine would never do anything that would harm him. She tried to say something else, but Daniel gently took her hand, deciding to believe her. Looking carefully into the girl's eyes, he decided to follow her this time too. However, he wanted to go to his father alone, so he hoped that the heroine would return to the palace. After all, in this case, if everything is revealed, the problem will not go beyond him. Leona agreed, deciding to wait for him in the garden, and the prince wanted her to open her heart to him when he returned. After that, he left the room and headed towards the king's chambers, along the empty corridors. Just before going out to His Majesty, Daniel hesitated for a second, but still found the strength to open the door. At the same moment, he noticed his father staring at him at the other end of the bedroom, sitting on the bed. The prince knew where he was going, but the emotional turmoil still got the better of him, and he froze in amazement. At the same moment, he fell to his knees, remembering how the princess had begged him to trust her. Meanwhile, Leona was alone in the night garden, remembering the prince's words that she never said anything to him. Sitting down on the bench, she felt that her head began to spin from all the worries. Suddenly, Daniel appeared, calling loudly to the princess, and she hurried to him. Approaching him with a sincere hope that everything went well, she heard that she was thinking only of herself. Very angry with the heroine, the prince blamed himself for trusting her, at least for a moment. Leona was completely at a loss, not understanding what had even happened. But instead of explanations, the hero continued to lament that Leona did not justify his trust. After that, he abruptly turned around and began to leave, leaving the princess in deep despair and incomprehension. Voices began to be heard from everywhere, quietly pronouncing the girl's name and feeling sorry for her. At the same moment, she opened her eyes and saw Daniel in front of her, who was trying to wake her up. The prince apologized for unexpectedly touching the heroine, who was moaning in her sleep. At the same moment, regaining consciousness, the girl began to beg His Highness not to leave. Shaking all over, she cried and repeated to herself that she did not want it at all. The hero tried to calm the princess, realizing that she was just sleeping. She must have had a terrible nightmare, but now everything was fine. Realizing what had happened, the heroine could not understand why His Highness had come to her. The only reason for his arrival was the girl's words that she would be waiting for him. Then Leona admitted that she was very afraid that the prince would leave her and go somewhere far, far away. From his father, Daniel learned that it was the princess who came up with the idea of sending him to the Empire. However, the girl was afraid that the prince's heart would leave her after arriving in another country. Looking at her, the hero was amazed at how strong Leona was as a person. He remembered well the day when they had first met in the carriage. From that moment on, the prince was afraid that he would not be able to help her and would not be able to become a good husband. He was also not sure that he could protect her from pain, which is why he felt scared to this day. The princess was very surprised by his words, looking at Daniel in bewilderment. Even in his previous life, he was the warmest person she'd ever met. And she didn't understand why the prince was so worried, because he was enough for Leona. However, the prince did not understand at all how he deserved such words addressed to him. The heroine became even more convinced that she would do everything for His Highness and would never leave him. Daniel made her promise that as long as he was at the academy, the girl would protect herself and be safe. Agreeing with everything, the heroine also promised that she would certainly wait for him. The next morning they returned to the palace, where Gwen and Eric did not close their eyes. The maid immediately pounced on the princess, who thought of pulling off such a dangerous venture alone. She also hoped that Leona would keep it a secret from Nancy, who would definitely kick the princess out of the palace if she found out. Now the prince had 4 days to prepare for his departure to the Empire. Thinking that the queen would faint if she found out, the maid unexpectedly hugged the princess. She was sincerely grateful to the heroine for her incredible efforts. However, the girl herself believed that it was worth thanking all her friends who helped. A little later, Tyler went to his mother again to look at the next candidacy of the princess. Zara's daughter humbly greeted His Highness, afraid to look up at him. The queen was delighted with her, believing that it would be better for the girl to wear low-heeled shoes. Tyler, in turn, looked at the heroine disgustedly, deciding that his mother must be joking. Couldn't she seriously think that this tall watchtower would be suitable for the role of a princess? But Miranda was convinced of her choice because, in her opinion, appearance was not the main thing for the princess. However, even so, the prince did not like her at all, and he refused to accept such a wife. As he was leaving, he pushed the girl hard, making her cry out in pain, and then calmly left. A few years ago, when she and Daniel were still children, they both studied at the palace library. While the heir was enthusiastically studying literature, Tyler looked at him nervously. Suddenly the king came, wanting to know how His Highness's training was going. Seeing the book in Daniel's hands, he wondered what exactly his son had chosen to read. A large book in the hands of the heir turned out to be an encyclopedia of court etiquette. The monarch was delighted with how hard Daniel tried in his studies. He hoped that in the future it would be so, because diligence in study was necessary for the future ruler. After that, after praising her son once more, she turned around and began to leave without saying a word to Tyler. The embittered prince did not understand. Who needed this Daniel at all? When his mother fell ill and died, all the servants were very worried about the crown prince's condition. One day, while walking through the corridors, Tyler heard a scream behind one of the doors and decided to look in. His mother was violently towering over the maid whose head had just been smashed with a cup. Miranda was furious. not understanding how the girl dared to consider Daniel the heir until now. Deciding to punish the good-for-nothing maid, she grabbed the second cup and hit the girl on the head with it. At that moment, she saw her son, who was shocked by what he saw. Grabbing him by the shoulders, she wanted him to listen to her carefully. No matter what the other fools say, Tyler will now be the crown prince, and she was sure that in spite of everything, the throne would go to him. And now the hero understood that if he became king, he should receive all the best, as befits a future monarch. But how could this insolent princess from Theon dare not even recognize him when they first met? The prince was sure that she would cry and crawl around, but the girl showed no interest in him at all. Moreover, Leona also began to belong to this Daniel, which infuriated Tyler. The hero did not understand why even now everything he wanted to get went to his elder brother. Moreover, the hero had to be with this terrible woman whom he suddenly met on the way. Zara's daughter looked at him timidly, almost crying and wanting to meet the queen for a minute. But suddenly, Tyler grabbed her by the hair, causing her to scream heart-rendingly. The hero didn't understand how she dared to greet him with such a gloomy face. Does she really think that she can get anything by becoming a princess? Furious, Tyler decided that if she bothered him again, he would finish her off himself. At that moment, Patricia appeared, who did not understand what could make His Highness angry. She came because the queen was looking for someone to play the role of the princess, so she decided to try her luck. In addition, the prince himself promised to make her a princess, but now she has become a laughingstock. Casting a malevolent glance at the servant's daughter, the hero thought that there was nothing to worry about. After all, in any case, such a princess was completely indifferent to him, which horrified the girl. After a while, the queen received reports of charity from a responsible servant. In addition, she decided to clarify that since His Majesty was in bed, the duty to preside over the prince's wedding was on her. Confused by the unexpected statement, the servant agreed, looking at her in bewilderment. Miranda wanted him to prepare Tyler's wedding the way he would prepare the crown prince's. The amount of expenses will have to correspond to the status of the heir, and also it is necessary to spread this among the nobility. The servant had already guessed about the queen's power, but it was too much to talk so openly about the crown prince. According to the laws of Rothair, this will be difficult to do because Tyler has not officially received such a status. As he spoke, an inkwell flew past him and shattered when it hit the floor. In Miranda's opinion, it was only a matter of time before her son became the heir. At this moment, the servant remembered that not long ago, Tyler had been appointed foreign secretary, and he wasn't sure if the prince's future would change in this regard. Ordering him to disappear, the queen decided to take this opportunity to show all who were worthy of being king of Rotira. Suddenly, Zara burst in with a frightened face and begged Miranda to come with her. Meanwhile, in front of the entrance to the palace, Daniel was met by a delegation from the Imperial Academy. Upon hearing that Crown Prince Rotera was interested in the training that would become the new wing of the empire, the emperor was delighted. He immediately sent a whole delegation to accompany him and wished him a good trip. Daniel was delighted with His Majesty's kindness and hoped that he would be greeted on behalf of the prince. At this time, the hero heard the whispers of the court nobles behind him, who were completely confused. Gregory wanted to receive the ambassadors on behalf of Rotaire, but he understood that they had a very tight schedule. Therefore, he hoped that they would receive His Highness well and follow up until he returned to the kingdom. At the same moment, an enraged queen ran out of the palace and looked at the scene in horror. First of all, she demanded an explanation and found out that the imperial ambassadors had arrived to take Daniel to the academy. Miranda was furious because all the affairs of Rotaire should only pass through her while the king was sick. She didn't understand who had planned this without telling her, and how dare the prince get out of the country without her knowledge. Tired of her furious screams, the imperial ambassador decided to clarify that he had arrived on His Majesty's orders to pick up the crown prince. As if she had not heard of His Majesty, the queen was even more infuriated by the fact that Daniel was named heir. She continued to rampage, trying to understand who dared to lure the prince out of the country behind her back. At that moment, the king came out of the palace, admitting that it was his will, causing the queen to become confused. With a look clouded with shock, she looked in his direction and saw Leona, who calmly led the monarch by the arm. They walked forward and stood next to the prince, to the joyful greetings of those around them. The king decided that when Daniel returned, he would officially give him the title of crown prince. Miranda, who was standing next to her and heard this, could barely stand on her feet from the shock. Looking at her with indifference, the monarch thought that he was still not feeling well and could not stand for long, so he decided to return. As he walked away accompanied by Leona and Gregory, the queen remained standing, mad with anger and impotence. After seeing His Majesty off, the princess returned to see the prince off on a long journey. He had come this far only because of her, so he hoped that the girl would take care of herself. The heroine made her promise that she would certainly reap his return. Daniel's biggest concern was that Leon might forget him in the meantime. With his hand on her cheek, the princess was sure that he had nothing to worry about. Suddenly the hero kissed Leona right on the forehead, a little discouraging her. After that, he hurried to the carriage, followed by the heroine's wet gaze, full of love and hope. For a long time, they communicated by correspondence, and thanks to the care of the king, Leona began to feel much better. In addition, the hard work of the court doctors helped His Majesty to finally recover. The positions of Duke Gregory and Marquis Ruber were significantly strengthened in the palace. Meanwhile, the Kingdom of Rotaire was preparing for the upcoming Folk Fund Festival. 4 years had passed since the prince's departure, and the heroine again wrote him a letter, not doubting that he was all right. Suddenly, Nancy called out to her from behind, reminding her that it was time to prepare. Having seated the princess in front of the mirror, the maid admired her stunning appearance, as if from a fairy tale. Leona was impressed every time by how much the once little Nancy had matured, turning into an elegant lady. The only thing that upset the maid a little was that over the past year, the prince had not written a letter to his wife once, but Leona firmly convinced herself and her that everything was fine and that he must have just had circumstances. However, despite this, anxiety still came to the heroine because after 3 years of active correspondence, he suddenly fell silent. After her preparations were completed, Leona went to an audience with His Majesty. When she came to him, she was very surprised that a letter had finally arrived from Daniel. The prince has completed his studies and will soon have to return home, which his father was incredibly happy about. According to Duke Gregory, the hero was significantly successful in his studies, and the empire was very reluctant to let him go. The princess was very happy to see him back, but she still didn't understand why he hadn't written to her for so long. A big surprise for Leona was that upon Daniel's arrival, the king decided to arrange a wedding for them. The heroine was very surprised and at the same time grateful to His Highness. The monarch understood that now, for some time, the girl would be busy because she would need to prepare her palace and the prince's palace for the wedding. Leona thought it was all too hasty, but she understood the king because, although he was healthier than before, there was no complete healing. After the monarch woke up, it became more difficult for the queen to use her power in the palace, but she still tried. Later, walking with the princess in the garden and learning about the upcoming wedding, Gwen was completely delighted. As for the heroine, it took her by surprise because her marriage to the prince had already lasted 4 years. Gwen, in turn, couldn't wait to see Miranda and Tyler's faces when they found out. The maid remembered that during the wedding of the second prince with Zara's daughter Flavia, Tyler had dressed her up as a queen. Gwen believed that although she was quiet now, she would surely follow any order from Miranda immediately. Therefore, the maid did not understand how the heroine could see Flavius in such a good light. At the same moment, while walking along the path along the garden, they unexpectedly met the wife of the second prince. Lowering her eyes and trembling all over, Flavia began to greet the girls nervously. Gwen greeted her back, and Leona thought they hadn't seen each other in a long time. Flavia admitted that she wanted to visit the princess more often, but she was always so busy and did not want to cause inconvenience. Suddenly, the heroine noticed a large bruise on the girl's arm, which she stubbornly tried to cover. Leona knew for sure that it was Tyler's fault, immediately remembering the events of her past life and deciding that it was time to stop it. Smiling at Flavia, the princess invited her to come to her palace so that she could give the girl a healing ointment. The heroine was horrified by such an offer, pretending that she could not do it. After that, she turned around abruptly and began to run away, leaving the girls in complete confusion. In the late afternoon, he and Gwen went to the market, where there were more crowds than ever. The maid persistently searched for a certain store, which turned out to be a confectionery, which had made a splash in recent days. The heroine was going to buy a lot of things, as well as eat with Gwen, while the maid decided to take something for her mother. Laughing, Leona realized that it was not only her mother but also Eric who, according to rumors, also liked sweets. Deciding to look around, Leona found Nancy's favorite candy on one of the upper shelves, who could not go with them today. The girl tried to reach them, but they were too high. Suddenly, a young man appeared who helped to get the right jar and handed it to Leone. The heroine was confused by the surprise and took the jar, thanking the stranger. As it turned out, his name was Rosero, and he considered this place unsuitable for a young, lonely noblewoman. The girl was very surprised by his accent, which was different from the inhabitants of Roterre. After briefly introducing herself, the heroine decided to leave immediately, fearing that she might be recognized. Suddenly, Rotero offered to talk for a while, but Leona pretended to have a companion waiting for her. Slightly saddened, the hero hoped that she would not refuse his meaningless greeting. Having received consent, he abruptly grabbed her hand and leaned his lips against the palm of his hand. Looking carefully into her eyes, the hero hoped that soon they would see each other again. Meanwhile, Tyler furiously shouted at Flavia, believing her to be incapable of being good at anything. Her dresses spoiled the image of the prince, and the girl could not even be compared with the wife of his older brother. Falling to the floor, Flavia shook in tears, apologizing for her worthlessness, which angered the prince even more. Suddenly, the queen came in, unable to understand where the noise was coming from. Looking disgustingly at the crushed girl, Miranda was shocked that she still dared to call herself a princess. In the queen's opinion, the only thing Flavia was good at was humiliation. Ordering her to get up, Miranda reminded her that it was the heroine's duty to serve the prince and keep him in good shape. Looking at Zara with mockery, she did not understand how this woman managed to raise her daughter so much. The maid apologized and promised to teach her how to behave. Then the queen ordered her to immediately take away her daughter, who, in the presence of the prince, brings only trouble. Taking Flavia out into the corridor of the palace, her mother began to shout furiously at her, considering her daughter to be a fool. Zara had warned her more than once that Her Highness was an extremely difficult person. However, even so, the daughter had to serve Prince Tyler properly. Only by maintaining the position of a princess, the girl will be able to help herself and her family. Tomorrow, Prince Daniel returns, and the whole palace knows that the king loves Leona, as if she were his own daughter. Therefore, the day the king makes Daniel the crown prince, everything will collapse overnight. Unable to stand it, the woman began to shed tears, and Flavia tried to console her, blaming herself for everything. At that moment, Princess Leona suddenly appeared, and Zara wondered what had brought her here. As it turned out, the irises bloomed very beautifully, and the girl decided to take a walk, after which she came here. In addition, she wanted to tell Flavia something about the national festival and hoped that Zara would allow her daughter to be recalled for a moment. The maid immediately followed Her Highness's request and left, and the girl followed the heroine. Leona wanted Flavia to help her choose a dress for the celebration, but the girl believed that the princess would probably know better. She was just afraid that she might spoil something, but she was grateful to the princess for her trust. Leona remembered that near the northern gate of the castle, there was a pond on which wonderful lilies bloomed, and she would have liked to walk there with Flavia later, with which the heroine reluctantly agreed. After that, the girl was finally able to return to her business, thinking on the way that Leona probably did not know anything about difficulties. The next day, the entire royal palace was on its ears, preparing for Daniel's arrival. The delegation and carriage were already passing through the outer gates of the castle, and the monarch was anxiously expecting to see his son for the first time in 4 years. As he and Leona stood in front of the main entrance, Tyler approached them, accompanied by Flavia and Patricia. He wanted to convey that the queen had a headache, and therefore she would not be able to attend this celebration. Leone wondered if Prince Tyler shouldn't be with the princess. Suppressing his rage, the prince pretended that he did not know about such care from his daughter-in-law. However, the king agreed with Leona, and given the importance of the event, ordered the hero to appear with the princess. Also, taking into account Miranda's condition, the monarch did not want her son to visit his mother too often. Bowing obediently to his father, Tyler began to leave, suppressing all rage and resentment inside. Seeing that Leona was hiding behind him, the king called her, because Daniel would surely be the one who would be most happy about her. Looking at the princess with envy, Flavia realized that the rumors turned out to be true and she really looked charming. The girl cursed Leona, knowing that she would surely be able to make Daniel the crown prince. At this time, the carriage with the hero finally arrived at the entrance to the palace, and everyone hurried there. Leona was a little worried, still not knowing why the prince had not answered for so long, and hoped that everything would be fine. When the carriage doors opened, everyone around could hardly believe their eyes. With a slender gait, a handsome young man stepped out of her, in whom it was difficult to recognize the once feeble prince. Appearing before the king, the hero bowed to his father with respect, kneeling. The monarch greeted his son joyfully, while Leona stood in bewilderment. The prince shifted his gaze to her for a second, and at that moment, time seemed to slow down. And at the same moment, he turned away abruptly as if afraid to look at the girl. Leona was shocked to the core, shocked by what was happening. She was sure that he had been staring at her for a second, and now it was as if a barrier had grown between them. Meanwhile, the third prince of the empire approached him, greeting his majesty. The heroine recognized him as the same guy from the store who helped her get a jar of cookies. However, she had no idea that he might turn out to be an imperial prince. The king also greeted him, realizing that the prince must have traveled a difficult path. In addition, the monarch was sincerely grateful to everyone who helped his son return home. In the evening, there would be a banquet in honor of the prince's return, and the king wanted Rotero to join him. After the welcoming ceremony, the monarch, together with Leona, invited the prince and the delegation to the palace. After a while, as planned, a banquet was held, after which the ball began. First, Prince Daniel walked into the ballroom holding his wife's arm. The girl was uncomfortable with the isolation of the prince, who had become much taller in 4 years. Passing by the dance floor, the heroes approached Gwen, and Daniel wanted the maid to take care of the princess a little. Gwen was very surprised, because they had not danced, and the first song was about to play. But the hero still left them, and Leona thought that, probably, he had no feelings for her at all. The heroine only wondered if he really forgot her or met another lady. Gwen was shocked, and did not understand why he was leaving when he had such a beautiful wife. Then the girl took her hands, pretending that everything was all right with her. However, despite these words, Leona's eyes betrayed her inner sadness and depression. After a few minutes, Gwen decided that if the princess felt uncomfortable, she could take her away from here. At this time, someone approached them, rejoicing at the opportunity to see Her Highness again. It turned out to be the Imperial Prince Rotero, who hoped that the princess was asking him for his rudeness. Gwen bowed to him, and Leona also apologized for not recognizing him right away. In addition, the princess considered him a delightful dancer, and Rotero thought that in such a place, he could not help but show his skills. He asked the girl to dance, but Leona remembered that she and Daniel had not yet had their first dance. In response, he gently took her hand again and kissed it, after which he hoped that the princess would spend a minute with him. Meanwhile, Daniel stood on one of the balconies and watched this shameless flirtation of the imperial prince. At some point, he took out a small case from his pocket, looking at it sadly. Languishing with inner emotions, he did not notice how a modest female figure was watching him from around the corner. Looking at him, Flavia was completely delighted, thinking that she had finally found her chance. A little earlier, Rotero approached the hero, who was standing alone on the balcony. He wanted to apologize, because before that he thought that everyone in this kingdom was as cruel and stupid as Daniel, but he was wrong. The people turned out to be quite gentle, and the women were extremely beautiful, so the imperial prince wanted to stay here. Daniel laughed in response, realizing that Rotero had been wandering around to analyze it. The hero even thought of getting married here, which amused the prince even more because Rotero has always been an opponent of marriage. Remember at least the time when he embarrassed his own father, the emperor, at the ceremony of his coming of age. Rotero wondered if His Highness was going to stand here for the rest of the score. He didn't understand why Daniel had left his wife to talk to him. According to the hero, it was worth looking around, and you could see many ladies who wanted to share the first dance with the prince. Noticing this and starting to shake his head to the sides in confusion, the prince was horrified. Looking down, Rotero thought it was especially worth taking a closer look at the girl who had been looking in this direction for a long time. It turned out to be Flavia, who was looking at Daniel fascinated, but as soon as he turned around, she was immediately confused. Frightened and ashamed, she instantly disappeared into the crowd, wanting to fall through the ground. Daniel was well aware that this was the second princess of Rotera and Tyler's wife. Surprised by this news, the imperial prince decided to start moving. When Daniel heard that he intended to invite his wife to dance, he was confused. He demanded that the hero stop immediately, but he only waved his hand in response. And now, looking at the case in his hands, the prince looked at Rotero's attempts to ask Leona to dance. Flavia, who was standing next to her, thought that since the imperial prince could invite the princess to dance, she could also invite the prince. In addition, the girl was sure that since they were a family, then there would definitely be no problem, so she boldly went to him. Suddenly, Eric approached Daniel, causing Flavia to return around the corner in horror. The Duke was outraged that the prince had not yet given his gift to the princess. However, as he rubbed his neck nervously, Daniel doubted she would like him. And yet, Eric was sure that the prince should give the gift to her, at least so as not to regret it in the future. Leona had been waiting for him for a very long time and with great impatience, so he simply had to approach her. At this time, taken aback by Rotero's proposal, the princess decided that she should give her first dance to another. This was the answer he expected to hear, and the hero did not understand how Daniel dared to leave his wife alone. The character of Rotero was very different from the prince, and the heroine wondered how they became friends. As it turned out, even the scarecrow like Daniel couldn't keep his mouth shut when he shared a room with him. Rotero was impressed by how hard the hero studied and how much time he devoted to training. For some reason, the prince now had the same expression with which he had arrived in the Empire. And that didn't mean he was scared, but on the contrary, Daniel was very embarrassed. Rotero decided to confess this to Leon because apparently she did not read the expressions of men well. Unexpectedly, Daniel approached, wanting the imperial prince to leave them alone. He wanted to talk to the princess about something, and Rotero hurried away. A little taken aback by such turns, the girl no longer knew what to expect from His Highness. Stretching out his hand to her, the prince hoped that the heroine would reward him with honor, share the first dance with her. He was incredibly sorry that he had made the princess wait for him for so long. However, at the same time, he dreamed that Leona would give him another chance. The girl gladly agreed, admitting that she was also waiting for him. Eric and Gwen were delighted to see them on the dance floor, and all the guests were amazed. The characters gently circled around the playground like two pigeons shining with each other. Daniel danced much better than Leona had originally imagined, but the prince was completely sure that before her ability to dance, he still had to grow and grow. In addition, he noticed that the princess looked especially charming today. Blushing, the girl looked away embarrassedly, smiling gently in response. When the music ended and the dance came to an end, the characters bowed gracefully to each other. Later, walking through the night garden, Daniel was grateful to the heroine because only thanks to her he was able to study and not worry. The girl remembered that over the past year she had not received a single letter, and she wondered if she could ask him about it. Instead, she admitted with a smile that she was genuinely waiting for him to return. She worried that the hero must have forgotten her, which made the prince very surprised. Then, Leona admitted that she was really waiting for his letters, which never came, so similar thoughts began to come to her. Without noticing it, the girl opened her feelings to him, thinking that perhaps she was complaining for no reason. However, against all odds, Daniel was sure that he had been writing messages to her all this year. Hearing this, the heroine stared at him in bewilderment, her eyes bulging wide. Remembering that this year he had given them to Rotero, who apparently decided to make a joke, the prince was filled with rage. When she finally found out what was going on, Leona laughed heartily, feeling relieved. The happiest thing was that the misunderstanding that had arisen was finally resolved. Looking at her smile, the hero again made it clear that all his efforts were in the name of the princess. Therefore, he hoped that the heroine would trust him a little more. Glowing with happiness, Leona was sincerely grateful to him for these words. Then the prince finally decided to give her a gift, starting to take out the case. After handing it to the girl, he wanted her to open it herself and see what was inside. Upon opening it, Leona was amazed to find inside a necklace that His Highness had bought in the Empire. The princess was delighted with the grace and beauty of the piece, and the prince hastened to help her put it on. The heroine was not sure if this jewelry would look good on her. Then the hero reminded her of his words that she was lovely, after which he gently kissed her neck. Blushing with embarrassment, the heroine decided that it was unfair of him. Meanwhile, the queen was in her chambers, surrounded by society ladies and Zara. One of the women decided that she could go to the banquet, but Miranda didn't see the need to do so. However, the lady insisted because the empire was very powerful and the ambassadors were sent personally by the emperor. But the queen considered this delegation more like a servant who was sent to accompany the child. The women began to discuss how the emperor admired Daniel's achievements and even gave him the title. Slamming the table abruptly, Miranda didn't want to hear it anymore, horrified the ladies. Miranda sincerely believed that she had been tricked, and the women wondered who dared to do this. According to the queen, it was Daniel who played the idiot and deceived her with it all the time. Now she reproached herself very much for not knowing before how independent and determined the prince was. Then one lady suggested that if this continues, then it is Daniel who will become the crown prince. At this moment, Miranda realized how inactive she was that even they dared to say that. She wanted to know where this lady got so much audacity to say such a thing. Horrified, the woman began to make excuses that she was only expressing her interest because the prince was not the only problem. The queen agreed with this, considering the girl from Tien to be the biggest thorn. With a malevolent grin, she ordered the imperial prince to be called to her immediately. After a while, having received the invitation of the queen, Rotero thought that this work was becoming interesting. The closer the hero got to the queen's chambers, the more luxurious the atmosphere became, which greatly surprised him. Now he was convinced that all this time, Miranda herself controlled everything. When he finally arrived at the queen's chambers, the imperial prince greeted Miranda with respect. She was well aware of the rumors and was extremely glad that the prince had found a minute for her. Rotero expressed concern about the queen's health, but in her opinion, this was the lesser of the problems. She couldn't even get a greeting from the king's eldest son, so she was very happy about the hero's visit. Knowing that despite his age he was not yet married, Miranda wondered if the prince wanted to look for a wife in Rotero. Rotero knew that she had probably not summoned him to talk about marriage. Finding him quite impulsive, the queen wondered how knowledgeable the imperial prince was about trade. It wasn't his strong suit, but even he knew that the majority was monopolized by Duke Gregory's family. The duke used his strong position by engaging in trade with many countries, including the empire. Miranda remembered that her relative Duke Ratian also had a large and rich territory. And if the empire wanted to open new trade routes, then Radian was ready to reduce tariffs and pay generously for goods. And if Rotero also meets her son and Daniel's only brother, then the queen will have nothing more to desire. The hero was grateful for the offer, but his visit to Rotero was only to congratulate his dear friend Daniel. Besides, as the third prince, he couldn't be involved in politics, so if the queen was done, he wanted to leave. Turning around, he thought that since Prince Tyler was already an adult, then he could make his own acquaintances. Meanwhile, Daniel accidentally injured his arm in a training fight against Eric. Leona immediately ran up to him, starting to wrap the hero's hand in the cloth. Upon approaching them, Rotero was surprised that the heroes decided to compete. Knowing that His Highness was quite good at sword fighting, the Duke immediately expressed a desire to spar with him. Rotero agreed, knowing that perhaps the knight would find his skills mediocre. The hero took off his cloak, and after a few minutes, both fighters were facing each other, ready for battle. At this time, the princess was happy to find out that Daniel was doing well. Standing next to them, Gwen sincerely wished Eric luck as she cheered for him. Drawing his sword, Rotero decided to get to know his opponent better. At this time, sitting in her chambers, Miranda thought about Leona plotting behind her back. Looking askance at Zara, she knew that Daniel was only thriving because he had a good woman by his side. As for Tyler, it was the other way around, and the queen blamed Flavia for it. After listening to Miranda's screams, Zara returned to her daughter's chambers, thinking that the queen now notices even the slightest flaws. Entering Flavia's chambers, she surprised her daughter very much with her appearance. Zara was infuriated by how calmly the girl sat on an armchair, embroidering a handkerchief. However, the maid reassured herself that if her daughter sewed a beautiful product, it could change something. However, when she saw the white cloth with Daniel's initials embroidered on it, she went mad with anger. She believed that her daughter did not have the slightest ambition, and only by making Tyler the heir, she could achieve well-being. However, Flavia considered this impossible because Daniel participates in the opening ceremony of the festival. This means that he is recognized as an outstanding personality, as well as a full-fledged heir. Unable to stand such impudence, Zara hit the girl on the cheek with all her strength. She knew for sure that if her daughter said such words in front of someone else, then both of them would not be able to escape. After that, she grabbed Flavia's embroidered handkerchief and threw it into the burning fireplace. The girl thought that only His Highness truly understood her. The next day, the maid admired the smell of the pastries that Flavia had prepared. However, the maid was very surprised to learn that these sweets were meant for Daniel. However, the second princess thought that it was none of her business, as she just wanted to thank the hero. Walking to the prince's chambers, Flavia dreamed of how much he would like her treats. But the girl's main dream was to merge with him with her lips in a passionate kiss. Near the hero's chambers, she was met by the prince's servant, who was very surprised by the appearance of the second princess. She told about the purpose of her visit, but as it turned out, Daniel was not there now. Then she decided to just leave the tray of pastries with the servant, hoping that he would hand it over to the prince. After she left, the butler examined the tray, thinking that he had never eaten today. And for sure, there will be no problems if he accidentally eats 1 or 2 cookies. As soon as he took one bite, he was suddenly called out by Leona, who came to the prince. When she learned that he was not there yet, she saw the snacks in the hands of the servant and wondered where they came from. Looking away, the butler pretended that he had made them and invited the princess to try them. The girl was delighted with the skill of the butler and the taste of cookies, after which she found out that Daniel was in the garden. Then the heroine hurried to His Highness, leaving the satisfied servant to eat sweets. The prince was very surprised to see Leona in the garden and was shocked to hear that she had been pushed out. As it turned out, he and his friends began to play dice, and Rotero asked to bring the hero. Eric was very excited, perhaps because of yesterday's defeat in the fight. Daniel understood him, for it was the first time that the dukes had fled so easily. Having decided to take a short walk in the garden together, the heroine recalled last year's opening day of the ceremony. The prince heard that she helped his father a lot, but the girl believed that it was the king who helped her. In addition, she felt obliged to do so because the monarch had done so much for them. In the meantime, they have come to the place where they made promises to each other 4 years ago. Kissing Leona's hand gently, Daniel was grateful that she had kept her vow. After that, their lips merged in a romantic dance of soulful spring in their hearts. Suddenly, the heroine heard a strange crunch nearby and looked around in confusion. The prince hoped that everything was fine with the girl, but she just heard some sound. The hero was very afraid that she might not like something in their kiss, but she was completely delighted. Meanwhile, hiding behind a pillar and holding her breath, Flavia could hardly recover from the shock she had received. In the meantime, after a general consultation, Duke Gregory lingered with the king, wishing to tell him something. But the monarch himself guessed that it would be about the position of the crown prince. Gregory knew that the king turned a blind eye to the queen's actions because the power of Duke Rydian could not be ignored. However, the monarch was sure that the duke had absolutely nothing to worry about. He was going to make Daniel crown prince, right after the founding of the state. Gregory thought it was the right choice, but he wondered what the king intended to do with Tyler. Upon learning that the monarch was going to make him an archduke, the hero was confused.